This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please
Welcome to today's committee meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag #AssemblyPlanning for this meeting. Please may I remind everybody to switch off their phones or switch them to silent, and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Today we're holding an investigation on unlocking housing development in London. Before we begin, we have a few items of business to attend to. Can I ask our committee clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received from the Chair today, Assembly Member Boff, and therefore, in accordance with Standing Order 2.1b, the Deputy Chair is in the chair for today's meeting. Assembly Member Terrell is attending as a substitute for Assembly Member Boff, and in addition, in accordance with Standing Order 8.2, with the permission from the Chair, Assembly Member Wilson will be attending today's meeting as an observer.
Wonderful. And so we'll get to the questions, but first of all, I want to welcome you all to our first Planning and Regeneration Committee of this term. Obviously, we've had announcements which might feed into your responses from the new Chancellor. I'm very happy to see that we have a new Chancellor talking about planning reforms, but welcome to all of you. So I'll kick off. Given the identified housing need in the London plan of 52,000 new homes a year until 2029, what's the sector's current capacity and intention to contribute to meeting this demand? Now, if you could just go straight across from Bernadette, working downwards, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chair. Bernadette Marjoram here representing Metropolitan Meridian Housing Trust, which is an SME providing 100% affordable housing at below market rent. So we have a blended rate of 65% of market rate, but obviously it depends on individual properties. So that's why I'm here today. And having said that, I think affordable housing is really the key issue in London. London works because of that sector of people that is unlikely to be helped by a council waiting list, is having challenging rents and cannot afford. So organisations like Meridian Housing Trust provides accommodation in that sector. Looking forward, I think there are ways of trying to increase the ability of SMEs like ourselves to add to the affordable housing delivery. I think, and your colleagues will correct me, but I think we are probably the only or one of very few that provides our type of product. And we have a capacity to do more, but I think the presumption is we get small sites. And what that does, it disproportionately impacts us financially because our costs can be very similar to large development. So I think there's issues there around how we are treated, but I do think there needs to be some segmentation when we talk about increasing housing delivery, because there are different segments within that. And we don't want to lose the need to provide affordable housing. It can very much focus on private housing, and it misses out considerably. So I would like to see something around a presumption when there's affordable housing coming forward that will get preferred consideration so that we can increase those targets across London.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bernadette. James, would you like to go next?
Good morning. I'm James Wickham. I'm a partner in the planning team at Gerald Eve. We're a multidisciplinary planning consultancy, multidisciplinary property consultancy. We have a planning team of about 120 people. I predominantly work on mixed-use residential and commercial development in London, and across our team that's similar. So we have a good experience of a range of sectors, particularly more around the commercial aspects. And as a planning consultant, you'd expect that I approach the questions that you have with a particular focus on the planning elements, and that's probably my starting point. On your first question, I think I make 3 points. I think firstly, there's a continued downward trend in planning applications and planning activity. We've seen that nationally, and that trend is reproduced and perhaps even slightly more acute in London. So the continued reduction in the number of applications being submitted and the number of units is a concern for the capacity and the delivery, if you look 3, 4, 5 years down the line, as to when those schemes would otherwise be coming out of the ground. So I think we are concerned about that. Specifically on the capacity point, there is also a huge resourcing issue. Actually, on the private sector side, as much as the public sector side, speaking as a planning consultant, we struggle to recruit the planners that we need. We struggle as a private sector company to resource the complexity and respond to the complexity of the issues that the planning system is throwing up. And we perhaps don't have the resource constraints in doing that we are very conscious that public sector colleagues are responding to. So there is a huge resourcing challenge in planning departments in London and in the planning sector more generally, trying to respond to those issues, and I think that goes directly to capacity. I know that the GLA is doing good work on trying to develop and improve the availability, also a centralised resource that local authorities can draw on to support their planning delivery, and there's some good work going on that we've been participating in through industry and through business, working with the GLA on developing that. But those resourcing constraints are significant, and they're growing. So we welcome, and I'm allowed to touch on the announcements from the Chancellor yesterday. So,
everybody has been invited here because you're experts in your field, and you're free to say as you want today.
Wonderful. So we obviously, in that vein, we welcome the announcement from the Chancellor about the 300 additional planning officers that are going to be recruited, but that's a nationwide thing. I think that there are well over 300 planning authorities across the country. By our calculations, it works out at about 0.9 of a planning officer per local authority. So that's great, but I think we need more. I think that increase in resourcing is disproportionately low compared with the increases in the complexity of the system. And my third sort of opening point would be around creating incentives. We are in a market economy, and landowners, property owners have a choice about whether they release land for development. Developers and investors have choices about whether they deploy capital, where, when, how, and in what they choose to invest. And I think it's important that we retain and perhaps strengthen the incentives that are in the system to support the delivery of housing, and particularly support the delivery of housing compared with other uses, other asset classes in London, because we all recognise housing as a massive nationwide and regional priority for London. It's hugely important across the affordable sector and across the broader housing market. But actually it's more difficult now often to develop housing than it is other land use classes. And that doesn't reflect our priorities in policy, both from a narrow planning sense and in wider public policy. So I think we have to look again at whether that balance of incentives and signals that sends on where and how capital is deployed are correct.
Wonderful, thank you. Before I move on to you, Jeremy, I just wondered, for the other two panellists, the same question, but Bernadette has said that she would look favourably on a presumption in favour of planning where there is affordable housing. And Jeremy has talked about prioritising housing, including affordable housing, over other uses in the system. And I just wondered your reflections on that, in addition to the question around capacity and your intention or ability to contribute to the current demand that we have.
There we go. Hi, Jeremy Gray, Head of Policy at the Federation of Master Builders. So we're the largest trade association in the construction industry, representing about 7,000 members. So we represent everything from your sort of micro house builder to your sort of family-run business. We don't represent any of the majors, and predominantly we represent the sort of builders in the system. So we're sort of the skills behind delivering these issues. I will touch on that point around affordability, but I think to just touch on where our members sort of sit in the system, they've sort of been left to one side for a long time. SMEs used to deliver nearly half of all housing in the UK. The Federation was actually set up during the Second World War to coordinate builders to rebuild housing during the Second World War in London, then expanded that out to the UK, so it is doable. At the moment, SMEs are only delivering about 10% of housing need, meaning there's a reliance on 90% comes from a few companies rather than a diverse range, which isn't good for consumers. It's not good for the UK's reliance on housing need, especially if you compare it to other similar nations where you have much more diverse housing stock. I think the other point is, as well as skills, as we represent the sort of builders, as it were, the skills point on actually getting to, particularly what was announced yesterday from the Chancellor, 1.5 million is going to be extremely difficult, particularly if you're going to retrofit 5 million homes, if you look at infrastructure improvements as well. I mean, right now there are not enough people coming to the industry as it is to satisfy needs as it currently stands. I think it's going to be very difficult to uplift that across the UK and in London, particularly in London, where people are looking at other ranges of jobs and not vocational jobs. There's also a point about level playing field. I think that's been mentioned on the tiering system. It is basically exactly the same to develop as a small developer as it is a large developer, without the same level of resource. So even though it's a level playing field, it immediately makes it not a level playing field. And that means they're impacted by the slow planning system. If you're a sort of kind of much more reliant on cash-based, your business is much more cash-based, you have to have cash flow. If you have a slow planning system, ultimately you're losing money. It's very different, obviously, if you're sort of a larger, different business model where you have debt to rely on and you can borrow and so on. I think on the affordability point, it's point that was being made was that SMEs, I think, are often overlooked as not being able to be part of that solution. They absolutely are. In fact, they would quite like to have more affordable housing, more social housing in the pipeline, because it's a constant form of work for them. At the moment, they've got to find sites and build. If there is a plan for social housing, it's a nice pipeline of work that they can build to and historically have built to. So it's not anything new that they're trying to achieve.
And just out of interest, when you say that SMEs would like to be part of the solution in developing more affordable housing and contributing to that 1.5 million, how would that work? How does that manifest? What's the issue now that they're not?
Well, the sites aren't available. They can't find the sites. They're in the planning system. There's no sort of pipeline of work for social housing for them as it stands. That needs to sort of exist. And the barriers need to be removed to allow them to do it. They need to be thought of as part of the solution instead of sort of large strategic sites where you stick a lot of social housing. Sort of start to think about where it can go on smaller plots of land, and that is achievable. Yeah.
Thank you. And last but not least, Sarita, welcome back.
Thank you. Sarita Robinson-Gale, I'm Head of Affordable Housing for Barratt London. We, through the two divisions, deliver between 1,000 and 2,000 homes a year across London, and we currently have over 1,000 affordable homes in the planning system at various points. I would first of all say that all developers in London are both affordable and private developers because of the way the planning system works. Through the Section 106 process, we always deliver affordable homes on site. So we have the same issues with affordable homes that everybody else has. We also, currently the Section 106 system is kind of creaking at the seams, and there is a lack of capacity from registered providers to take the number of affordable homes that are currently in planning. So we will be in an unusual position where developers will be building out affordable homes and there will be no one to take them. I think I've spoken to other people kind of working my position across other developers, and it's not a Barratt issue, it's a London-wide issue, and it's something that we need to resolve urgently because it will start to act as a collar on development. So of the things I've noted, something that Jeremy mentioned is essentially if we can't get through planning fast enough, it becomes such a cash drain on the businesses that only the very largest businesses can take sites through planning. We used to take approximately 2 years from the purchase of a site to start on site, and recently that's increased. Post-COVID has had a lot to do with it, but it was always increasing, and it's increased up to 4 years. So if you're Barratt and you have large cash reserves, you can hang on to a site for 4 years. But if you're a smaller developer builder, essentially you just can't fund holding the site for that long. If it has something that's marginally producing on it, it's fine. If it has like an existing use that gives you rent, you might be able to make it. But if you bought a cleared site, essentially you're waiting for years and years and years with millions of pounds sunk into that cleared site that you can't then turn into construction. So that's acting as a kind of natural break. And it's also just meaning that smaller developers are just unable to deliver the volume that they're capable of delivering. So one of the challenges is keeping the large house builders going, delivering what we deliver now, and encouraging others to do more. Because if you look at how we've delivered over time, it's tended to be that the large house builders are actually quite static. What we deliver doesn't change that much over time. It's because of how our businesses are delivered. What happens is other parties are building less than they used to. So RPs are building less than they used to, local authorities are building less than they used to, SMEs are delivering less than they used to. So the challenge is to keep the big players going whilst encouraging the smaller players to do more than they are doing at the moment.
Thank you. Before we move on to further questions, I neglected to do part of the administrative bits of the introduction, so apologies from me. So this is for Assembly members, whether we can note the list of offices held by Assembly members, and can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the membership and the chairing arrangements for the Planning and Regeneration Committee as agreed by the London Assembly at its AGM on the 10th of May 2024?
Agreed.
And finally, can I ask the committee to note its terms of reference as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual general meeting on the 10th of May 2024?
Agreed.
Oh, sadly, not finally. A bit rusty. 2 elections in 2 months. And then finally, can I ask the committee to note the standing delegation of authority to the chair of the committee as agreed by the London Assembly at its AGM on the 10th of May 2024?
Agreed.
That is the last one. Back to questions, which are far more interesting. So I wanted to ask you if you've seen a reduction in the number of applications as organisations or for your clients as well. Just noting that there is actually a large, well, I understand that there is a large number of consents already in the system. And Sarita, you finished on a point about the time taken from planning from 2 years to 4 years, and obviously COVID has been a factor with other issues. Why have you seen that reduction, and why are the consents that are in the system not being built out in order to meet the need? Start this side.
Part of the reason that consents that exist have not been built out is because due to changes in building regulations, changes in policy, though some of those sites cannot be built out. So they essentially have to go back through the planning system. So if you look at the difference between a single staircore building and a dual staircore building, essentially, unless the building was incredibly poorly planned in the first place, you'll have to go back into planning to make that building larger than it was. So quite a few people have planning consents that for technical reasons they couldn't build out even if they wanted to. And also quite a lot of people have planning consents that because of the change in the cost of construction between when they bought the site and now, they can't afford to build them out in the way that they are currently consented. And I suspect if you look at the larger planning applications, there's probably quite a few of them.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
So we saw a slight recovery post-COVID. What we actually saw last year, though, was that buyer demand hit its lowest level we've ever recorded over a sort of 15-year period, just when surveying our members. Given SMEs are incredibly reliant on buyer demand to actually build out, we're expecting to probably see that dip off this year again, because as I say, it comes back to that cash flow issue. If you don't have the buyers, they won't be building. That's for a variety of reasons, and obviously I don't want to go over old history with the previous budgets and things, but that was sort of a contributing factor. So yeah, that's part of why we might see a dip in the market.
Yes, I'd endorse what Sarita has said. We've seen a very similar pattern, particularly in the more conventional sectors, including conventional housing, where there Where that perhaps is a little bit different is in some of the more unconventional uses, so such as student accommodation and that sort of thing. And again, I think that goes back to my observation at the first question about the sort of competing incentives and the signals that are being sent that actually housing, for the reasons that have just been described, which I'd entirely endorse, it has become very, very difficult to deliver. And there, quite frequently you will see a pattern where a developer, in our experience, who is 3 years perhaps into that 4-year process that we're now seeing, will know that the market circumstances have changed due to design constraints, finance constraints, the cost of delivery, but therefore 3 years into that process, however much money has been spent on planning, they will secure the permission even in the knowledge that it may not be deliverable because of those issues. So simply because a permission has been granted doesn't necessarily mean that it can then be economically delivered, particularly when you have that very long planning time period during which the sort of economic circumstances can change quite significantly. So we're seeing that quite, that's become more pronounced. And I think the knock-on effect of that is people are then less willing to actually start on that 4-year journey. And I think that's why, in part, you've seen the drop-off in planning applications across a number of sectors, but particularly acute in housing.
Okay.
Thank you. I think there's an issue here about focus on delivery, and it's no doubt that the changing building regs, this 2 lifts, policy, all that plays into it, and there are most certainly planning issues. However, I think across the housing field and all those different segmentations, I think there needs to be a reflection about how committed they are to delivering housing, because there are always reasons why things can't progress, and we can be sympathetic to that. But, the overriding imperative is to deliver housing, particularly in London. And I would say affordable is absolutely critical. And from my own experience, we have had issues around, 2 lifts, planning changes. But actually, we turned that around fairly quickly, and that was one of our bigger sites as well. So I think there is about the commitment to deliver, and there are different incentives in the different parts of the sector as to why they might deliver. So I think there is an opportunity maybe just to have that conversation. I mean, I'm surprised around affordability. I mean, we can't let house quick enough. And, my experience, and I've been on all sides of the table actually around this issue over my years, too often affordability is used as part of the viability testing challenge. So it's the affordability area that gets hit. And so the question is, are we hitting the right level to make those commercially viable whilst protecting the imperative to deliver? And are they the right sort of affordable housing in terms of size and where they're located? And I think Jeremy's point, I absolutely would endorse, is that we do need to be seen as part of the big picture, not a fringe activity, because I think, we delivered 50-60% of affordable housing across London, not we, the SME sector, last year. And I think when the data comes through for last year, I think it will be shocking in terms of the lack of getting sites underway. I think it will be shocking. And we've got to turn that round. We've all got different imperatives and incentives. We don't have shareholders. We don't make profits. Everything's ploughed in. And therefore, we can deliver, maybe in circumstances that others may not be able to or willing to. So I think there is a conversation which people put their cards on the table about what drives the requirement to deliver. And I would say that, yes, we need the resourcing plan. Absolutely, we need planning resources. Absolutely, the skills issue it is a challenge. But if we are really talking about we need housing and in London, which is why we're here, I do think there's a different conversation to be had about how we can engage with the different segments to bring forward housing. And I think now's the time to do it. You know, you've got a new government, you've got a re-elected mayor, you know, the ducks are aligned. There's talk about delivery, making sure we do what we need to do, and I think we need to focus on that rather than the challenges of doing it. Because whilst we have to address that, we have to deliver housing. It's not an option not to deliver in London.
Before I hand over to the next Assembly member, I just wanted to ask you, start with you, Bernadette. A few people have mentioned incentives, and you've mentioned incentives across different parts of the sector and how they might be different depending on the type of organisation you are. But also you've raised that very interesting point that in some parts of the sector, affordability versus viability, it might feel like housing for the housing sector is optional to deliver, and the planning system is blamed for that. I just wondered what solutions there are, and just to get a better understanding what those incentives might be from your perspectives, from your organisational perspectives for different parts of the sector, because I obviously understand the word, but I don't know what you mean by that.
Okay. For my sector, SME, the incentives would be a number of things, really. One is the pipeline. Make sure that we have good pipeline, that they're decent size sites, and not the thought that because we're in SME we can just do the small site, the difficult site that another doesn't want to do, because we have more to offer than that. And I think the idea of making us part of a partnership in bigger schemes is good, and that no doubt will come on to when we look at the various zonings that the Mayor has suggested, how that might play out. So for us, in the SME sector, it's a certainty around pipeline. We need to look at grant rates. Because of the issues that we've already touched on, the cost to us is disproportionate to the size. So I think there's an issue around grant rates. And also this need to make sure that the planning system adopts a preferred approach, with all the other things notwithstanding, to affordable housing to deliver it. We have skin in the game because we develop and then we manage. So we have an incentive there to make sure we're producing quality housing and not just numbers of units. And I think that also is a key issue, to make sure that it isn't just numbers, it's quality and longevity, so we're not building problems for the future. So I think there's a package of things we could look at for the likes of my organisation, which will increase the deliverability of the affordable housing targets, and relatively quickly, because there is capacity there to do that. So we're chomping to actually talk to how we might be able to extend our offer and do that. I think the incentives in other sectors, and other colleagues will talk about it, they're different. Yes, they want to deliver housing, but they're commercial. Now, I'm not saying we don't operate within a commercial context. Of course we do, because we want to deliver value for money. But we're not driven by shareholders and bottom line. So in other sectors, they can just say, we're going to pause, which is, I think, is what you'll find happened last year. It just paused because their driving priority is their bottom line. And we can understand that. But we can't allow that to be the only activity, because we have got a London-wide problem. So we have got to look at the different segments and how we can encourage those areas that can deliver and build out to do so, whilst acknowledging commercial realities. And that's a bit of my concern about some of the pronouncements so far. And I think we all welcome the Chancellor's statement in terms of resourcing. I think good. But I think there needs to be a bit of a nuance and a sophistication about that, because the private sector will always take the opportunity, because that drives them. Yeah, but we don't want to miss the opportunity of those other segments being able to come along as well. And that's why I was, referring to, considering presumption for affordable housing and other things too, just so that we are all moving forward. Otherwise, we might miss the opportunity that's before us.
Okay, thank you. Can I take Sarita next, and then we'll come to Jeremy and then James, and then I'll hand over to Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
So, notwithstanding what's just been said, the priority for my business is to deliver housing in London. We're a London business. That's what we do. We acknowledge that there are some private developers who have paused construction in London for, I would say, I think at least the last 3 years, if not 4. And that then has a significant dent on what comes forward. So I think that's partially what you can see in the lack of planning applications and the lack of starts, is that if some of the big developers don't deliver, who are delivering 1,500 unit sites, then that has a massive impact on the kind of flow through. But we still have an issue that if you are a developer of large sites, you have got a capacity issue with the RPs, which are your other partner, in order to deliver affordable housing on site. And we have to resolve that. So we have to acknowledge that there are smaller RPs who still have capacity to take units, but quite a lot of the large RPs do not, which, as I said, will act as a natural brake on our ability to deliver housing in London.
Thank you. Jeremy?
So I've just looked at our segmented data for London, asking what's going to stop our members building over the next 3 years. And the top one, unlike the rest of the UK, is actually cost and access to finance to deliver those sites, which is quite interesting. The rest of the UK, we've seen that drop off over time as financial packages have been developed by challenger banks and other similar organisations. In London, it appears that will continue to be an issue, and they will not be able to get the actual finance packages together to deliver homes. So that's obviously an incentive that needs to be looked at, some sort of incentives or maybe partnerships with organisations to deliver those sort of financial packages. I agree with everything else that's been said, though. A pipeline will be absolutely fundamental to sort of make sure they actually have that work in place. And just to touch on the quality point, that SMEs have to differentiate themselves from other developers by delivering a high quality product. It's the reason they sort of sell, and they can differentiate themselves in a competitive marketplace. Therefore, their costs overall are higher because the materials, the fittings, everything is that bit higher, and they're buying at smaller quantities. And very often they can actually be, particularly on the micro and very small side, they're out of the supply chain, so they're buying sort of off the shelf, which means their costs are higher, and they're subject to sort of inflation, quite difficult inflation from buying from merchants.
Yes, following on from Jeremy's point, we've seen financing being a real issue. So the question that sort of particularly commercial developers have is, should they invest? Should they access the capital and actually invest it and deploy it to do development? And that's in a context where there are other options available. They may simply decide, you can invest in a corporate bond at 7 or 8%, and you get your return with very, very little risk compared with development. So the first incentive is there an economic incentive to actually choose to do development as an economic activity? If you get over that, the second question is, okay, what sector, and not necessarily just the sort of broad residential sector, what sector do we want to invest in? So coming out of the back of COVID in some London boroughs, quite frequently you were seeing industrial and logistics sites or industrial and logistics developers competing very effectively with residential developers, and those sites were being promoted for industrial and logistics rather than residential, because the returns perhaps were similar, but the risks of industrial and logistics, the complexity, the design, the planning, the political complexities of it were actually far less. And then you add on to that the fact that there's no, effectively, your ability to make a return for delivering residential is capped, because you're subject to viability reviews. So you will never, your ability, you might make a loss, you might not make very much profit at all, but you will never make more than whatever the threshold is set by the GLA. And that is a constraint that doesn't apply to other asset classes, other land use classes. So if you have industrial and logistics and residential competing at similar values, one of which your return, you may just do a little bit better, and the other class, you have no option to do better. You'll put your money into doing one of those other asset classes, because we have made residential so complex. And so coming back to Bernadette's point, if we consider housing to be the overarching priority for London, we sort of need to say that. So the London Plan, I checked this morning, I think it talks about housing 753 times, because I did a little Control F. But nowhere does it say that housing is the priority land use. Now, when the London Plan was written, perhaps we didn't think it is, but I do wonder whether that's a question we need to ask ourselves. Certainly for the central activity zone, the centre of London, actually we say housing isn't, and its commercial functions are the priority, and that's probably appropriate. But looking more broadly across all of the boroughs, should we be saying that, so that we're actually directing decisions, directing where we want that investment to go when we're comparing those sectors, and then making sure those incentives are structured around it, so that actually we stand behind our words. We say and we give effect to what we mean in how we guide developers. I've got some more ideas on that, which I think probably sit under some of your other questions, which we can come to in a bit.
Okay, thank you very much. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to come to Jeremy first, because we've had a lot of conversation here about planning and the length of time it takes. What can be done under the current regime? Can something be done to reduce that planning risk? Is that risk cultural, or is it just technical? There's so much that you have to do to get planning through.
Sorry, Lord Bailey, you're looking at me, but you said you were directed to Jeremy. So,
sorry.
Who would you like to answer your question?
I'm bad with names, James, and then I'll come to Jeremy.
That's quite all right. Sorry, I didn't want to.
That's my bad. Excuse me. Excuse me.
I think it's there are so many factors in there. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, the additional layers of complexity that have been put onto the planning system, which are technical issues, is a real concern. So we've seen issues such as energy performance, such as fire safety, which historically weren't dealt with by planning, being put on for laudable reasons. Mm-hmm. But I think we have to recognise that does just generate additional burdens on skills, resourcing, time that often planning officers and planners are ill-equipped to deal with. So I think at one level that is a real concern, and I think that has affected the length of time that things taken to be determined. And for every one of those issues, it creates a sticking point where something can be stuck, or where if you want to oppose development, it gives you an opportunity to. I think there is a broader point, though, about sort of, and so political will, general will and direction within the system. And again, it comes back to what I said in my previous response around what are we actually trying to do? What are we trying to prioritise? Are we trying to prioritise housing over other considerations? And are we resourcing and structuring planning conversations at both an officer and a political level to give effect to that? And in some of the mayoral development corporations, actually, and sometimes in discussions on GLA referable applications, that can be a very effective combination. In other cases, that doesn't quite work, and that sort of senior officer political drive to get things delivered doesn't quite translate through onto the ground. So there are good examples happening where that is working, but there are probably too many cases where it isn't, and you are left sort of slightly floundering in this quandary of highly complex technical issues without that political and senior will to get things delivered through the system.
Understood. Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
It does. I come to Jeremy now, and I mean Jeremy this time. You talked a lot about a pipeline for SMEs. So I have a two-part question. What particular difficulties in the context of London are SMEs facing, and what would a pipeline look like? Who would be in charge of it? Who would instigate it? How would it be administered? What does a pipeline look like?
I think what needs to happen, they need to be part of the conversation when it comes to actually delivering on these homes, which at the moment SMEs are not in London and around the UK. They're not seen as part of the solution to, I think as I touched on, to deliver particularly social housing, but generally private housing. They're not seen as the people to go and talk to, and to integrate into local council systems and to be part of their delivery. So what they need to do, what needs to happen is we've sort of proposed...
Can I just interrupt you quickly?
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind pulling your microphone closer to you?
Yeah. Is that right?
Yes, that's
that
perfect.
better?
Thank you.
Yeah. So what we've proposed in happening is that's been successful elsewhere is SME planning groups, where the planning officers and the groups can come together, and SME groups can come together to discuss how they develop that pipeline of work, and a part of the conversation, because right now that isn't what's happening. But also when they are in the pipeline of work, they're getting stuck because they don't have direct contact time with planning officers, which can keep them in the planning system for months and months and months. I mean, I've been copied into emails like that myself with them trying to find a solution, where one email arrives 3 months too late, and they're just hemorrhaging cash in that time, whereas a direct conversation probably would have saved about 3 months of time in the planning system.
Okay, thank you. and one question to Bernadette. You talked about your particular model around creating what I think sounds like intermediate housing. Do you think there needs to be a greater emphasis on intermediate housing in the conversation about housing in general? Because we talk a lot about affordable housing here. We'll talk about our 50% target, all of those things. And we'll even use the word council housing. That's used quite a lot. But are we talking enough about intermediate housing? Has it been identified enough? And I say that because when you talk about incentives, if you want to incentivize something, you have to identify it very clearly. What would that identification look like?
Yes, essentially. Intermediate would cover it. And that's why I'm thinking there needs to be a much better understanding and nuancing of the fragmentation of delivering housing, because it can all get wrapped up and everyone thinks it's about providing private housing. I think there is a huge need. I mean, we can see that from when we let out properties, and we know that the people that are in the middle who are stuck, that won't get the local authority priority and then are struggling to price themselves into the private sector, that there is a need for this. And housing is one of the drivers for the economy, because you've got to have the people in the location to deliver. So I'm with James, is that we do need to be really clear, is this really the priority, and how it impacts on all the other social and environmental, economic issues, because it tends not to be centre stage. Everyone says it's a housing crisis and we need to do it. But okay, if it is a housing crisis and everyone is lined up behind that, how do we ensure that actually it's centre to our discussions? Now, in our situation, we have a really good and close relationship with the local authority. We are independent, we're a community benefit society, we are independent of them, but work hand in hand with them. So they have provided a pipeline and they've provided funding and a loan. However, that pipeline is drying up. And indeed, the ability to fund future schemes is also drying up. So we have to look at what the other options are. Now, if there is mayoral corporations going to be delivered in the borough, and I think there are opportunities to do that, then that opens up more channels. But we do need to identify it, and then actually how we address it. And that the focus isn't just on the commerciality of housing. It is around how people get into homes that make the city work.
Okay. And finally, to Sarita, you talked about RPs beginning to their capacities fall to accept housing that's being developed. Who's having a conversation about that? Is there a solution? Is somebody looking to solve that problem? Because it would be horrific for those homes to be developed and nobody to take them on. So is there any kind of conversation about resolving that situation, and what would you like that conversation to feature?
Thank you. Yeah. We've recently had sites where we had 100 units to deliver in Southwark and no RP to take them. And 58 of those units were social rented homes. The majority of them were 3-bed homes. So wow. Exactly what the really people of Southwark really need. And being in a conversation where neither the local authority nor RPs can take those homes. And I know that we're not alone in that position, where, you know, we're a big enough builder that we're able to start those homes without someone to take them. But if you were a smaller developer, you probably wouldn't have started on site without someone already lined up to purchase them, because you wouldn't have been able to afford to pay to build them. So it's definitely a thing that is occurring, and I suspect it's going to get slightly worse, because we're big enough that we carried on building and we got to 60% of the way through before we were able to find a partner. But if you were smaller, you just wouldn't be able to keep building those homes. You would just stop on them, you would slow down. And then the accusation you would face is that you're not, you know, focused on the delivery of those homes, but you really don't have any choice. We can't hold them, we can't hold rented property, we can't rent them. They have to be taken by a registered provider. So I think in the short term, it's going to be a London-wide problem, because bigger London RPs are facing costs due to, you know, works on existing properties, repair works to do with building safety, that have kind of drawn their focus away from development and drawn their ability to deliver their own programme as well as to purchase Section 106 homes. I understand that the GLA is looking at it, but I suspect it's going to overtake us if we're not very careful, that we will have lots of homes that are getting towards completion without RPs to take them.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, panel. It's been really interesting so far. We are going to, what I'd like to do is sort of put the conversation in a bit of context, ask you a bit of context so far, and we're going to ask you in a minute specifically about changes you might want in the London plan. So I'm going to try not to like bulldoze into that too much, so we can keep those things separate. But we've talked a lot about the sort of things that you think in general might be the problems with the planning system, and also touched upon some other ones. So how much do you think, in terms of the failure to deliver housing targets, how much of it is down to the planning system and can be resolved through changes to the planning system, and how much is other issues that need to be solved by, like, for instance, the wider economic situation, the structure of how we deliver houses, who delivers houses at the moment? Does that make sense? Do you have a sense of would you be able to give us a sense of how much you think is one or the other? Does anyone want to jump in? Jeremy, thank you.
I'll go. I think there's something clearly has gone wrong, particularly for the smaller house builders, because, you know, as I noted at the beginning, they used to deliver nearly half of all homes in the UK, and particularly in London, and that has dropped off to now 10% of all homes across the UK, and about that in London. So something has happened over that period of time that has pushed out smaller house builders from the marketplace. And time and time again, the planning system does come up. There are probably financial issues every now and then where financing is needed, but we've seen over time that solutions have been created to those financial burdens. Obviously in London there appears to be sort of continuing issues there, but the planning system and the complexity of the planning system and access to that planning system for smaller developers has been hindering and pushing them out of the sector. I mean, we have members that sort of jump in and out because it's easier. They build houses every so often, then they'll go and become general builders. And that's what we're actually seeing more and more of, particularly in our membership. To sort of keep the business going, they'll jump out of the essentially house building because it's too complex, too costly, not worth it. Just go to putting it's more cost effective to put extensions on houses than it is to stay in the housing system. So it's the complexity of the planning system creating cost, but also just creating a time burden that they cannot take from a cash flow perspective.
And so you think that what needs to be done is that we need to lessen the requirements through the planning system? This is what I'm trying to get, you know, the specifics of it, because we haven't, and again, I'm trying not to get into the questions of what you think you shouldn't have to do, because that's, of course, the nuts and bolts of it, isn't it? What do you think you shouldn't have to do? But what else could be done around that planning system? And there has been quite a lot of talk about the skills in the planning sector. There are commitments for, you know, numbers of additional planning officers to be trained. Is that enough? How much would that assist small house builders, particularly here, to navigate their way through the system, or is it just you need less of it, full stop? How much? Because if the burden's all falling on the smaller house builders, then I can understand that's a problem. But what's the solutions?
I think it's a mix of, extra planning officers and extra capacity in the planning system would be helpful, because we do see the one of the primary issues is contact with planning officers is the burden that's causing cash flow problems. Therefore, that would inevitably help small builders build more homes, basically. But it's also the amount of we've sort of said the amount of hoops you have to jump through as a major and a small, they're exactly the same, which doesn't quite seem right, especially when you don't necessarily have the administrative capacity. In fact, you almost definitely don't have the administrative capacity as a smaller developer to do that, and you don't have planning experts and planning consultants. These all have to be hired in. So it's cost and time and effort, and therefore that stops the delivery.
But I'm sure you'd agree that just because a home is built by a small home builder rather than a big developer, it shouldn't be less safe, less energy efficient, any of these things. So I'm assuming you're not suggesting there should be a sort of two-tier.
No. It's the support that's provided to them to help them, because we haven't really seen a company go from being a small house builder to a major in a very long time. That sort of movement has stopped. Yeah. So there has to be someone has to support and enable that to happen. You know, it's good for diversity in the market if there are more players sort of across the spectrum, but also and SMEs do tend to build better quality homes anyway, because that's the sort of product they have to deliver to be competitive in the market. But no, I'm certainly not saying they take anything out of the system. They just need to be supported to deliver homes.
Thanks, that's really helpful. I wonder if I could come to apologies, but I've got a specific question about construction, which I think might be you might want to comment on, which is, of course, there are other issues around the cost of materials and construction skills, which have become over the last few years much more acute. And how much of that is a problem, and how quickly do you think that could be solved? How much of that is a barrier?
Yeah, well, the skills issue is quite existential, I would think, to the industry at the moment. I mean, you're seeing apprenticeships at sort of around 30,000, but there's a 50% dropout rate. You're seeing an ageing workforce. I mean, most of our members that own the business owners are over the age of 50. They're probably going to retire. They might fold their businesses. And just generally come out of it. People in construction retire earlier anyway. They tend to retire in their 50s because they've been on the tools, so they just don't have the capacity to work beyond that. Therefore, you're not really seeing the needs being fulfilled as it is. I mean, if you're looking at 50% dropout rate, you've probably got 15,000 apprentices really finishing their courses, and you need, I think the figure's around 50,000 just to satisfy things as it is. So we're way off. I mean, if you start to add capacity into the system in terms of more houses, more retrofit, etc., there's just not going to be the people there to fulfill it. And there's a whole, that's probably another session on, on how society sees vocational skills and things like that. But yeah, that's fundamentally the problem.
Absolutely. We certainly don't have the time to talk about it, but I think it's really important to acknowledge what a big issue that is. And thanks very much for Bernadette, and then I'll come to Sarita.
Yeah, I think we're in a bit of a perfect storm with regard to your second question. Because of the delays in the planning, the increasing costs in terms of construction and the deficit of skills are compounding one another. So there is an imperative to look at the planning system, and can I just say it's absolutely about not dumbing down quality. Absolutely, and I think that's important to make that clear. But I think if there were ways to try and simplify the planning system. So these hurdles that we've all talked about from our different perspectives exist and we go through, which then quicken. It means we're not then being hit by construction costs down the road, and maybe some of the skills will still be around. So it is a bit of a perfect storm. And just the point on RPs, a lot of the RPs now are commercial entities. And so therefore when they're looking from a very commercial perspective. So I think there's an issue there about it all comes down to costs and funding and where you put the priority in that. So I can understand why some RPs aren't stepping up, because they now have got commercial requirements themselves because they're building and selling. So they've got bottom lines now, which in the past may not have been the case. They're a different beast to what they were previously. But no, so I think, there's mutual benefit in speeding this whole thing up for all the reasons that you're, implying in terms of costs. But core is quality and sustainability in all its manifestations of the building in terms of long-term quality. And therefore how you manage those properties going forward is really important.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think, James, you made reference to sort of it being easier to build a big industrial warehouse or something like that in homes, and I think probably it should be. And how do we make that? How do we equalise that, I suppose, rather than make it as easy to build a load of things that people are going to spend their lives into? So the question about the balance is still open. So Rita, did you want to come in on that?
I just wanted to say it's not about reducing the requirements in the planning system, it's about rationalisation. So what we've done over the past 10 years is we've just added things. So we've added new requirements, and we have not looked back and seen what impact does this new requirement have on the previous ones. So what people are doing is we're individually working it out. We're individually, site by site, rationalising planning policy and coming to what we think is the answer. And I think that there's an opportunity now to take stock of the changes that we've made. Some of the changes that we made were entirely necessary, and we definitely had to do them. I'm surprised we took so long to do them, like around building safety, for example. Entirely required, and no one is suggesting that we row that back at all. What we are suggesting is that we have a look at what impact does that change have on the previous changes that we asked for, because we're going to end up with some really weird anomalies. One of the ones I think we're not paying enough attention to is residence management companies and the responsibilities for building safety on ordinary residents going forwards. I think that's a problem that we've caused by making a series of changes that have unintended consequences. I mean, that's one that I have visibility of, but I'm sure there are others, and I think we just need to take a little bit of stock and we need to work backwards, and it's, as you said, a case of simplifying rather than reducing.
So how much of the problems in completing housing projects is down to the need to simplify the planning process, in your words, and how much is due to other things?
I would say in a way you can't unpick them, because having a poor planning system just adds so much cost that then you have less money available to deal with the other issues. So building materials are approximately about a third higher than they were before COVID. That's a massive cost that you've got to take on board. And if you only had a certain amount of profit on your site as a small builder in the first place, you can't, if you've already lost it during the planning system, if you've already used that money, you can't use it again to pay for the additional materials.
And I think we're hearing from the small organisations. I think that's really helpful. But I mean, obviously, if the industry is asking authorities that have control over the planning system and regional and national governments to change it, it would be good if we had a fair idea or a better idea of what exactly the impact is going to be, rather than sort of just going simplification is a good thing, because that sounds like a nice soundbite, but we have also had some fairly major unintended consequences from what may have seemed like rationalisation. So I think we need to be really careful like that. So I think, I'd certainly like to hear a bit of sharper answer from some of the bigger developers exactly what you're asking us for. I wonder if I could, James, did you want to comment on those things?
Yes, briefly. I think what I've seen over the last 10 years is the sort of ranking of issues. Planning has gone up that ranking. So if I rewind to 10 years ago, it was probably 4 or 5 down the list, and there was particular concern about build costs and skills. Those remain. But I've seen in the sort of the very pointed questions that I get as a consultant from my clients, and actually from often from the analysts and the investors that sit behind them. 10 years ago, they didn't really want to talk to me, which is very sad for me, but they didn't really want to talk to me as a planner. Now, I'm key, sadly, to them making the decision about whether they're going to fund developments. So that doesn't fully answer your question in giving you a proportion, and I don't think I can, but there has been a material change in how planning is viewed by investors, and I use that word rather than developers because we're talking about access to the funding and the investment, and that's changed. I think there's also, and maybe I'm straying into the next bit about, well, what do we do and how do we simplify, which you're alluding to. And I'm going to be very provocative, if you don't mind. And you said earlier that we don't want to make buildings less safe and less energy efficient, and we don't. Is the planning system the best way to ensure that sort of outcome, or do we need a question about what's the planning system for and what is it not for? Because planning, to my mind, it's a hugely how we use land. What we do with land is a hugely contested political issue. And everybody will have a view on it, and you'll know that as politicians better than I do. So do we need a conversation about how we resolve those tensions separately from how we make sure that, bluntly, buildings don't destroy the environment and they don't kill people, which I think is what you were alluding to. Yeah. Should those issues be resolved through the same system, or should actually it be a given that whatever is built, wherever it's built, for whatever purpose, is safe and environmentally sound, and we deal with those issues separately? It's a deliberately provocative question. I'm not supposed to be asking questions.
No. It's a really interesting. I'm sort of jiggling back because I'm genuinely interested in this. Because I think that we're doing it through the planning system because we can't be sure that it can be done in another way. Yeah. So how would you, and this might be, we don't have a huge amount of time, so, but how would you think that, what alternative is there? Because we can't, unfortunately, as people sitting here are responsible for people living good lives, frankly, and being safe in their homes and having happy places in their homes. How could we be sure of that outside the planning system? You may want to come back to us separately on that, because you probably have loads and loads of thoughts about that. But
I'm happy to give thoughts now if you're content for me to do so. And I think you're right. We're doing it because there have been failings in other areas, so I think it's probably goes beyond what the London Plan can do and what individual planning authorities, strategic authorities, can do to some extent. But I think it does illustrate a bigger issue, and I think trying to get some clarity on what planning does and doesn't do at a national level and design regulations around it rather than conflating different regulatory systems, which is what we've got that is happening at the moment. And in that conflation, in the interaction of those systems, it is causing a degree of confusion. And because you're having a technical system interacting with something that is rightly politicised, it is right that people participate in a discussion about how land is used and how it affects them. It's absolutely right. But because of that combination of issues, you get some unintended consequences. And is the way we're doing it right? I think we should be prepared to ask that question whilst recognising that we're in the world we live in, and something's going to get granted planning permission tomorrow, and I, as a professional, you as sort of the leaders of London, need to be confident in the safety of that building. So, I recognise the reality of the situation, but I don't think we should be afraid to ask ourselves some of these questions.
Thanks. Thank you. I'll back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Small Edwards, please.
Thank you very much. My question kind of follows on from the last one, really, and it's about the London Plan and what alterations could be made to that to help speed up delivery of housing development and ensuring we're meeting our targets. Can go from kind of left to right, from start with Bernadette, that's all right?
I think there's elements in the London Plan which are really good, like the discussion about the corporations and the zones. I think that, and there's history to creating those types of vehicles in the past in London and elsewhere. And I think that could kickstart. And I think it could also, Jeremy's point, bring in SMEs to be part of that discussion about delivering affordable housing in those areas, and it will to some extent streamline. I think it's important we don't lose the community participation aspect, and that we bring the communities along with us. But as I say, we have had examples where it's worked and it has kick-started good housing economy and really place. How do we bring place together so we're not just building blocks and blocks and blocks? So I think that's very good. I think we would support that very much. I think we do need to look at targets and how we set those and monitor those and who's accountable for them. And it plays into the point Sarita was making. Without, you've got these affordable housing units. So, okay, you may be hitting a target, but actually, if they're not being occupied, what target are they meeting? So I think there's some sophistication around all of that we can have. And I think GLA generally to support the likes of SMEs, perhaps more so, prioritise them more so in terms of grant, and how we can assist making those targets hit. So I think that I'm supportive of it, and I'm actually quite supportive of some of the comments on the government review as well. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not antagonistic to one another necessarily. But I think, the political plates have changed, so I think it's an opportunity to reflect now what the government is looking for from London and what London wants from London, and how those two now come together. So I think there's a piece of work to be done on that. But generally the thrust, I think, is right. How that's delivered, I think, needs some more discussion.
James?
Thank you. We've touched already on sort of greater clarity on prioritisation in the London Plan, so I won't sort of repeat that. But I think that is important. I think we've got an issue about. It's quite a technical issue, but about actually how we make changes to developments that have been permitted, especially if we're talking about the sort of 3 to 4 year period to get them through planning. Things change, and you need to change things. That's partly an issue about sort of national legislation, how the system's structured, but I wonder if there's an opportunity for the London Plan to be a little bit more, a little clearer as to what will and won't be sought when schemes have to be changed, because that is a barrier sometimes to actually getting those alterations through. I think also there's a sort of question about how strategic the London Plan wants to be on sort of detailed design issues. And so, the report from the group in February talked about very detailed comments on internal space standards, that sort of thing. I spent a lot of my time debating the technical details of cycle parking design, often with GLA officers. I'm a cyclist. I like cycle parking. It's really important, but I do wonder whether that's the appropriate role for strategic policy. Great that we have lots of cycle parking, so that's another example. And then finally, and I'm afraid it does come back to this incentive point, I wonder if there's something that can be done around getting developers to actually incentivising developers to deliver quickly when permissions are granted. Recognising, as a carrot, perhaps recognising that it won't always be appropriate to seek review mechanisms in all cases, and there will, but the stick, so that could be the carrot, but the stick is you need to actually get on and deliver quickly. So if you deliver quickly, you get your permission, you get your conditions discharged, and you get on site. Actually, there isn't necessarily a role for review mechanisms. So you're delivering that scheme into the economic environment in which it was granted, and there's a potential for the developer to do a little bit better than was anticipated. That's the incentive for them to actually get on and deliver it. The stick is if they don't do that within a narrower period of time, actually it reverts to the usual approach. So that's something that could perhaps be considered.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, GLA is doing a great work, actually. I mean, the small site app, for example, is quite an important bit of a product that our members do use, and we've been promoting to the housing minister, actually, the various housing ministers over the last couple of years, to see if that can actually be developed at a sort of more national level, because that's actually the kind of area we need to see more promotion of small sites. But it's whether our members feel that small sites are on the decline. So are local authorities sort of identifying as many as they could be? Certainly our members feel that's not being done. They're not being promoted. Yes, the GLA is probably doing better than most in having that app, but could there be more promotion of these small sites? Could they be identified? Is that identification being enforced, essentially, as is in the MPPF? And I think it goes on to the point of that we've discussed the sort of planning officer / SME groups. Is that a good way forward? Is that the support that our members need to actually develop houses? I think it probably is. Could the London Plan look at that sort of level of support? And just generally about promotion of diversifying the market, seeing SMEs as part of the solution to delivering housing need. There's a good portion in the London Plan about small site promotion, but about actually identifying that diversity in the housing market is a positive thing. It's good for consumers, and it's good for the marketplace, because you have more players available.
Thank you. Sarita?
One of the things we haven't mentioned are accessible homes, which I think we could take more of a strong stance on in the London Plan. I think we are not delivering as many accessible homes as we could, and although the overall policy exists, they're not actually being built out to Part M requirements. I think there is, if we're looking at zoning, we need to make sure that we are investing in the infrastructure to back that up. We were in a strange position a couple of years ago where West London didn't have enough power in the grid for the number of homes that had planning permission. That is the kind of thing that will have an impact on whether or not we decide to take planning sites forward in that location, because you wouldn't want to be in the position where you've completed your development but you're unable to power up. And we're relying on developers to reinforce the grid, and I think that is the wrong way round. And finally, looking at fast track. So fast track currently is at 35% affordable housing, but in practice what's happening is if you come forward with a 35% scheme, you're often being made to go back through the viability process at stage 2, so that you needn't have bothered with, bringing forward a fast track application. Essentially, there is no difference between a fast track and a non-fast track application in terms of time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, just a couple of points. One's around density and height, because if we look forward a decade, the sites that we have got won't be there, and there'll be very few sites. So unless we go out, London moves out, and there's some talk about that, we have to go up and we have to increase density, particularly in areas of high need. So I think there's a nuanced debate about that. And just so I don't forget, it's not mentioned before we finish the session, there is another provider, and I say this because in another life I chaired one, which are community land trusts. And whilst they won't provide a significant contribution to the overall net need, they are nonetheless providing a product for some communities that welcome it. So I think in this segmentation, we shouldn't forget them. Okay, as I say, I used to chair one, so I understand what they bring. It isn't the quantity, but actually there's a quantitative issue there, and qualitative issue about them. Thank you.
with the Housing Committee, which I also sit on, we went and visited a couple of community land trust developments a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, agreed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We may actually invite you back to the Housing Committee, even though you just said that. We're looking at CLTs there at the moment. So, yeah. Yeah. Assembly Member Tarrant, please.
Thank you. Is the government's brownfield presumption enough to reduce barriers to developing this land, and how effective would it be when applied in London?
I think in London it doesn't make that much difference, to be really honest. I think that was already our presumption.
Yeah, I'm unfortunately probably going to say the same thing. It will help, but I mean, I think there isn't enough brownfield. There aren't enough brownfield sites in London to fulfil the housing needs. So it will help a little bit. I think it's 300,000 could be fulfilled on brownfield, but there's housing needs about 1.8 million. So it will dent a very large piece of the housing market, but won't sort the issue.
Yes, I'd agree with that. It's helpful, it's necessary, but not sufficient, I'd say. It's not going to solve the problem. We've touched on a number of the other issues that we're still faced with. I think that broader prioritisation of housing in some areas, that could include brownfield, but other places as well, is perhaps the most helpful component of it. But I think that prioritisation of housing as a real issue that we have to address is probably more important than the sort of technicals of a brownfield first tilted balance, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I mean, I support everything that's been said, really, and James's point is, which we've returned to, which is we need to make, we, the collective, is housing is it the priority, and therefore what flows from that? And that's a big question. Because there are political realities and management challenges in all that. But it is the question, I think, that needs to be looked at. And really, it goes to my previous point, is there's less and less land opportunity unless we start taking other zoned areas. But even then, if you look forward 10 years, a decade, if you take a strategic view, the land won't be there. So that's why, unless we go out, we go up, and that's a conversation, I think, that needs to happen. What does that look like going forward?
Thank you. I do have some other people that came before you, Assembly Member. So let me take Assembly Member Garbett, Assembly Member Baker, and then I'll take you after that.
Thanks, and thank you so much for your contributions today. Bernadette was really interested in what you were saying earlier about the viability testing and the element of affordable housing, and I wondered if you could just unpack that a bit and just talk us through what you think the impact is and what could change. And then just kind of related to that, just any way that you think the Mayor could be contributing to scaling up small and community housing developments. Thanks.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. I was saying I've had many different lives over my years, and one of them was as a director in a local authority which had planning responsibilities and other things. So I've been in many negotiations with commercial developers, and the truth of the matter is they're very good at negotiation. And when it comes to the viability, they have lots of sound arguments as to why, typically affordable housing gets squeezed. And local authorities aren't necessarily at the same table able to counter some of that. So the impact of that, whatever the rights and wrongs of that, is that the viability test tends to broadly reduce the affordable content. and then it hits 106 generally. So there's, and that's just the reality of that negotiation, and I don't criticise it. I just think all parties need to be at the same level in order to conduct that negotiation. But it does mean that communities tend to not always get what they think they might have got from a development, and I think that's just the reality of what happens, Sarita. And, you know, it's not a criticism. You know, they're good at it. And that's what they're there to do, because their incentives and their priorities are different. So that's, I think, sort of part of the mix. In terms of what GLA could do to help SMEs, I think there's an issue around grant rates. Because of the points Jeremy was saying, that there are costs that we carry which are disproportionate because they tend to be smaller sites, and the longevity of the process hits SMEs particularly hard. So I think there's an issue around grant rates which could be looked at to help overall costs. And I think the pipeline, they could look in terms of their own strategic plan and look at their, their SHLA and say, actually, what do their sites look like? Are you actually maximising the opportunity in there? Because there are some omissions in that SHLA, which I think could help SMEs going forward.
Yes, of course.
I would just like to say that's why it's important that the fast track isn't fast track, because the fast track was an incentive to developers to provide 35% affordable housing, and it was the counter to the horse trading of doing the viability assessment and working out where we got to. So if the fast track acts as the fast track, then it's an incentive to deliver that and not spend months and months and months going through viability testing, trying to reduce the amount of affordable housing on site. So if the fast track doesn't act as a fast track, then developers have no incentive to do that, and might as well go down the viability route.
Thank you. Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you. My question is on the same sort of subject, which is around viability in social homes, because obviously we're not in the Housing Committee. That may not be relevant to you, but it is sort of to us. We try not to step on any toes, but we can't just build homes. We need to build the homes that are needed, and obviously our last assessment of that said it should be 65% affordable, and that may be even more substantial now. And again, I mean, I'm going to slightly come back to the question of what the industry wants to get rid of, and is there any sense from any, you may not want to own up to it yourself, or you may want to point in other directions, but is there any sense that the viability process as it is now, flawed as it is something that the industry wants to change? How is the industry going to deliver the homes that Londoners in this case actually need? Yeah, thanks.
I'm happy to dive into that one. I think viability it's not a brilliant process from anybody's perspective. It causes delays, it causes mistrust, and if there was another way of doing it, I think that would be welcomed. I think partly it's because of our model of how we deliver social housing, that it's developer-led, and that's, again, it's a much bigger question. Is that the most effective way of doing it? It's not how we've done it in the past. So that I'm not going to answer that one, but I think that's the subtext to this issue, and I think the subtext to your question. But if we're working with viability, there are things that can be done to improve it. I think understanding how those discussions are conducted and making sure there is a level playing field, as Bernadette said, on both sides, to have that discussion in a transparent and objective manner, that can help to build trust. And I think there are aspects of the forthcoming affordable housing guidance that perhaps don't actually contribute to that, and the industry has fed back on that, and again that may be an issue for the Housing Committee. I think speed, again, we've talked about the length of time, and that's a concern, and I think the other element of it is is it creating, a degree of carrot and sticks? And again, this is what I said to Assemblymember Small Edwards around incentives to actually get on and deliver when something has been permitted. At the moment, the review mechanisms that are linked to viability outcomes are quite a significant disincentive to delivery, because the scheme, the development, can only ever perform so well. You've agreed a profit level of 20% or whatever it is. That's the best it can ever do. So there's no prospect of doing better than that, because the viability, the review mechanisms essentially prevent that. But there's always a very good chance that you'll do significantly worse than that, or even make a loss. And that is, housing is disadvantaged because of that, compared with other land use classes. So is there a way that you can say, if you get on and deliver this quickly, we're going to do quick, efficient viability discussions, maybe linked to the fast track route. If you then get on and deliver it quickly, that's the end of that conversation, and we will accept that maybe we have a slightly lower outcome, but that scheme actually gets delivered and you get the housing and the affordable housing as a result, rather than what we're seeing, going back to those very early questions, lots of permissions granted but not started, which is what we have. Is there a way of slightly adjusting and reconfiguring those pieces of the jigsaw?
Thanks. That's really helpful. I would love to ask you the question that you're not going to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway, which is it... Given that, and given what's been said earlier on, that the planning system is not necessarily the best way to achieve some of the outcomes that we now ask it to achieve, and I'm putting words into all your mouths. You may disagree with that, but I think it's persuasive. Is it really possible to deliver the social and affordable homes we need through the planning system as it is, even if it is sped up? Even if it is rationalised? I'm thinking of all the wonderful euphemisms we've used earlier, and simplified, rationalised, all those things. Is that possible, or is that something that we need to look elsewhere? Because it is the subtext to all of this. We need to build the homes that Londoners actually need.
I'm happy to put my head on the block, and I'd simply look back to the 1970s or pre-1979 as to how social housing was delivered, and the private sector built about half of our homes, local authorities, RPs build about half, and we now build about half we need, mainly by the private sector. I sort of think the historical record sort of answers the point. I don't think the model we currently have is the best way of delivering social housing. That's a personal view, but
yes, an informed one. Sorry, did you want to comment on that?
I had to look through how many homes we had built, and the last time that we'd built 300,000 homes in a year. Yeah. And what you find, if you look back, is that private developers have delivered between 150 and 100,000 homes. It's almost level. There's a dip post 2008, 2009, but it comes back up, and private developers have delivered roughly the same throughout. So the challenge is, where do we get the top up from? We need additional construction. We need to not disincentivise private developers, but we need to incentivise other delivery. So I think I said right at the top of this, we need local authority construction, we need RP construction, as well as maintaining the existing private construction. There's no answer that doesn't involve doing more than we currently do. The challenge is not to disincentivise the people who are currently doing something into doing less than they currently do, whilst encouraging others to do more.
Thanks. Bernadette? No, that's definitely unconked out.
I've clearly been speaking too much. It's tired. I think it comes back to the segmentation of provider I was referencing, because I think there are different things for different segments that could be done and encouraged. So for an SME, I know that we could do more if we had a pipeline and we had grant rates which support. So I know that, and I'm sure other SMEs would be in that situation. So I think that there needs to be a sophisticated breakdown of the different providers, so we sustain what we've got and how we can build across the different sectors to encourage more in each of those segments. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen fairly quickly to say, actually, how can we do it? What does it result in? How do we keep what's happening? But how can we build more? And it is about, it's not just numbers, although it is numbers, but it's also about where it is, how it's produced, and how it provides a community benefit, and making sure that it's targeted in the high need areas. And also looking at growth areas. You know, we need housing in the growth areas. So I think there's a conversation about how you segment it and what different approaches you have to each to encourage more building.
Thanks. Thanks very much, and forgive me for my probing.
Thank you. Assemblymember Small-Edwards, please.
Yeah, I think something which has come through quite clearly is that the panel doesn't feel like housing is necessarily the priority, or that's not clear enough, maybe at a London level or a national level. What kind of do you think can be done to make that signal, and why is that not being made clear at the moment?
Okay.
I think you should say it in the London plan, because it doesn't say it at the moment.
Yeah, and everyone will say we've got housing. I don't think there's anybody in the room that would say we haven't got a housing crisis. But how do you translate that into something which addresses the crisis? And I think that, you know, it's about delivery. It is about what you do to make sure you make real your attempts to deal with what is evidently a crisis. And part of that is naming it. And what flows from that then is a whole series of policy directions potentially and changes. I mentioned the SHLA, and colleagues that looked a bit odd. What I'm talking about, you're familiar with the SHLA, the strategic housing, yeah, is that talks about housing land. Well, actually, you know, I think it was James saying maybe we should look at industrial and other commercial areas and actually what could they produce in terms of housing? And then who could do that in the best and the most effective way? So I think there are things that can be done, and I think those things are not necessarily high political stakes, because I think everybody is accepting we have a housing crisis. But I think there are things that can happen now which help give voice to that in reality on the ground.
Thank you. And then Assemblymember Lord Bailey, and then I have one final question.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Sharita first. You talked about we need to bring up the other housing providers, SMEs, etc., and I agree with that. But what can be done to encourage the large builders to do more? Because you're a sector who are in shape to scale more quickly than anybody else.
I think the presumption in favour of housing is one of the issues. So if I look at the sites that we've bid on in the past 4 or 5 years, we have, not just ourselves, other builders have lost out to other sectors. So we'll bid on sites and we'll be outbid by people who want to build sheds, we'll be outbid by people who want to build student housing. So that means none of us are delivering those homes. So it's not just that we're not just competing with each other as developers to buy sites and to build out sites. We're competing with other sectors, which I think means that it isn't clear enough that that site is a housing site. So that's, you know, if we also can't get hold of land, then we'll stifle our build. We have the capacity to do more than we do, but we're held up by land supply, planning. And actually, the thing that we're not held up by is cash. We have cash. We have access to cash. We have access to people. But if I can't get sites, I can't scale up from where I am. So I think that better clarity about what sites are for housing would make a massive difference to our ability to deliver on housing targets in London.
So James, I suppose that brings me to the obvious question: does the London plan do enough to say these are housing sites, these are infrastructure sites? You know, is it a role for the London plan to be much more of a town planning London plan? You know, to be very, very definite about how much land is put aside for housing?
Yes, I think it can be clearer. I think you can start actually at the NPPF. I think that could be clearer.
Okay.
Because I think we're talking about London, but this is a national challenge, and obviously London sits as part of a wider southeast housing market. So I think firstly you can look at the NPPF, and it has a very balanced approach at the moment. It doesn't prioritise housing as a sector, in my view. If you look for that sort of language of prioritisation, it isn't there. So I'd actually start there. But then taking it onto the London plan. I think if I talked about the centre of London, the central activity zone earlier, and the London plan is very clear there that generally commercial development is the priority. I think that's right, incidentally. But there isn't a comparable statement about the land use priorities outside of the central activity zone, and I think there should be. And so I think you do find... and I'm sure this is an issue for the London Plan review that they'll be looking at, but I think you do find some sort of slightly counterintuitive issues where one's protecting sort of secondary office space in some sort of major transport corridors. You're protecting industrial uses, prioritising and protecting those uses rather than housing. So no, I think in the circumstances we're in, I don't think it does enough at the moment, because you've heard the empirical evidence of what's happening on the ground, and how housing developers are competing with those other sectors. There's not a criticism of the plan. It was written in a slightly different time and circumstances have changed. But I think, can that focus on housing be sharpened? I think it could be quite helpfully.
Tiny question. Jeremy, would your members feel the difference if there was a greater focus on housing or infrastructure, or will they build anything? Does it not matter to them?
No, I certainly think if there's a promotion of housing in the London plan that would help them, particularly their sector. If it's seen as a positive thing for SMEs to help be part of the solution, absolutely.
Okay.
I think that's a signal to the market, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Chair, back to you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. My final question, because we are the Planning and Regeneration Committee, I also wanted to ask, in the context of this conversation that we've had today, how the system can work for existing communities, because obviously every part of London there are people that have already been there for a number of years, and the new Chancellor has again taken a view on what is termed NIMBYism, but I don't want that to be used pejoratively, because people have genuine concerns and they should be addressed. But people just saying no to stuff is not a reason to build homes. And you used my favourite phrase, it's either up or out when it comes to London. So how, in the context of this conversation, how do we also make sure that existing communities are part of that process? Would anybody like to go first?
Well, we're in the quite positive position that a lot of our members are actually from the communities they build in, so they can actually be part of the conversation that's had with the community when they're developing out. And that's one of the benefits of working with a smaller developer when you're looking at housing need. They're often from the very place they're building in, so know the need, know what local wants and what they don't want. So that's again part of that promotion piece. It's seeing smaller developers as part of changing the narrative on development, I suppose, as being a positive thing for the local community. It's not being imposed upon them. This is a sort of development almost from within itself, from within the community, by someone that lives in that community or is familiar with that community.
I think there is a bit of an elephant in the room on this one. And sort of, I look back over my regeneration experience, you're not going to make everybody happy. And I think that has to be understood. Don't make omelettes without breaking eggs and all of that. But I think the key is that you have a strategic vision for what you want to do. You communicate that, you engage with people, you take on board as far as you are able. But at the end of the day, there will be people who are not happy, who will vote no. And I think it's a fool's paradise to think, everyone's going to be happy and everyone's going to get what they want, because they won't. But what you have to do is the right processes in place to consult widely and deeply and all the different constituent parts of that community, so that at least they understand if they don't get what they wanted, they understand why not. And in my experience, and I've stood up in front of some very hostile audiences, as long as they understand what you're doing, they might not like it, but it's treated them as adults, and it said, this is the reality. This is what's affordable. This is what we can provide. We can't do that. And I find generally people will, say, okay, you've explained it, you've taken a bit of heat, and by and large, they'll go with that. But I think we have to accept across, the room that we won't get it right always. And if we need to do this, yes, get the processes right. Yes, let's get the people in that can engage in, with stakeholders as well as communities. But recognise at the end of the day, a decision will need to be taken, and it will inevitably not suit everybody. But if you've got the strategic vision right, then I think that's what guides you. That's your plumb line going forward.
I was going to add to that. I think plan making is really difficult for local communities to engage with it because it is a very opaque process. It's complicated and technical to follow. So can we do more there at the outset rather than the community only becoming engaged when applications are being determined for individual schemes? And the reason I say that is because the planning system can be so hyper-localised in terms of how those views are expressed that it gives it can be perceived as giving an exaggerate or a disproportionate voice at that later stage to quite a small group of people, and at the same time the wider community whose needs aren't being met, across London or in individual sectors of London, they find it much more difficult to express their views and be heard at that time. So there's a sort of systemic imbalance there that we have to grapple with, and I think it comes back to Bernadette's point. We have to recognise that because of that balance, whilst it continues to exist, it can create the perception that a perception that doesn't quite reflect the reality on the ground. So what can we do more in the preparation of plans to get people involved, and how can we get wider engagement on those individual applications as well from a broader selection of voices than we perhaps sometimes have?
Just to reiterate that, I've heard it said that local planning applications, in terms of who responds, it favours the housed rather than the unhoused, in terms of who gets to respond to that and who gets to have their say. I think that plan making piece is absolutely key. You should not be in the position where you are suggesting that a 20-storey building is built somewhere and everyone is surprised that this is the proposal. So at the plan making stage, I think it's really massively important that the widest possible part of the community has a say on what the community is going to look like in 5, 10, 15 years' time. So I don't think we should be arguing over like 1-storey, 2-storey on a development. I think we should be quite clear as a community what we're expecting to see developed. And it may take some time to come forward, but I think that is the point at which everyone should have their say. And I think we should spend way less time than we currently spend on tinkering with individual developments as they come forward. We should have spent much more investment deciding as a community where we wanted to put density, what we wanted to see come forward, and what other services, because that's one of the things that we often face on a development by development basis, which is what other community benefits are you bringing as well as this number of housing. So what supporting things, what education facilities, what medical facilities are you bringing? We should have had that conversation at the plan stage rather than expecting developments one by one to bring those community benefits forward.
Thank you, all of you, and thank you for bearing with us. I'd like to thank each of you for your insights and your expertise and sometimes polemical responses. It's been really helpful. So we have now reached the end of the panel session, and we would normally take a 10-minute break, but I'm going to propose 5 minutes so that we can get the second panel on. But thank you so much, and we will be in touch with all of you, no doubt. Thank you. Welcome back to the London Assembly Planning and Regeneration Committee and to our second panel of guests discussing unlocking housing development in London. We're joined by Michael Ball, who's the coordinator of Just Space, Joanna Drew, who's the co-chair of London Council's London Housing Directors Group, and Jayashree Astley, lecturer in town planning at the London South Bank University and with 19 years of experience working in town planning. So welcome to all of you. And as I said to the first panel, we've invited you here because you're all experts in your field and you know things that we don't know. So in response to our questions, you're welcome to say whatever you wish. We don't have a party line, so to speak. We want to know what you know and your views. So with that, I will hand over to Assembly Member Garbett for the first question of this panel.
Hello and welcome. So mine's quite a broad opening question, just about why the housing needs of Londoners are currently not being met. And if you want to fold in any comments about our current understanding of what housing need is, you are welcome. But yeah, just why you think our housing needs of Londoners currently aren't being met. And if I start with Jayashree and then go to the right.
I think, as we've said, delivery has been the biggest problem so far. Our housing need is not met because of the viability. I think viability is a really big issue for developers, for anybody that delivers housing. The planning system insists on a number of I say hoops that you've got to jump through lightly, but I do mean all the restrictions, you know, the requirements, the legislation. There's so many legislative, what I would call barriers to housing in London, that the delivery is not happening around London. Things like BNG, for example, it's biodiversity net gain. That came in late part of last year and means that each site, doesn't matter whether it's a big site or a small site, would need to show a 10% biodiversity net gain. Now, for the bigger developers, you know, that's totally affordable. For the smaller SMEs and businesses, they've got the same requirement. And in that case, you know, a 2 habitable unit could usually ends up with them paying about £70,000 and so, or something like that. And so I think delivery is a real problem in London at the moment. And personally, I think it's because of the legislative requirements that I put on so many of the people delivering those houses.
Okay, I'm also Strategic Director of Housing Regeneration at Enfield, as well as my co-chair role, just by way of background. We heard earlier that the last time the country was building enough homes to meet needs was when councils were actively engaged in housing delivery. So I think that's a major part in being able to be part of the solution to ramp up supply in the way that we need. Councils have been strong advocates in recent years and have really grasped that agenda. So in the GLA's Affordable Housing Programme for 21-26, you'll see that 50% of the affordable housing proposed under that programme was being delivered by councils, and that compares to 10% of the previous programme. So you can see that there's a real commitment from boroughs to take on this house building agenda, which is going to be very key to the future. We have land, we have relationships with communities, we have placemaking skills. All of those things can come together to make us uniquely equipped to be a major part of the solution. There are ways in which councils need to be supported in order to deliver, and globally councils are suffering a extreme financial crisis at the moment, and we are also in our housing revenue accounts, which funds council housing, have severe constraints. So additional funding and levers is really required to enable us to have the resilient platform to sustain delivery. On housing needs, there has never been a greater time when affordable council housing is needed. Members will be aware of the extreme homelessness crisis that we're facing in London, played out by families living for prolonged periods of time in hotels, costing London £1 billion a year for that unsuitable temporary accommodation. So overall, the housing needs are dire, and the agenda for councils is compelling. We're grasping that agenda, but we need more support in order to deliver to our maximum potential.
Thanks. Why are our housing needs not being met? What are our housing needs? We're focusing on delivery here, but actually housing needs are not simply delivery. The experience, I represent several hundred community organisations across London. The experience we have, and I think the experience of most Londoners, is unaffordability. That's the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue that housing is too expensive to buy, housing is too expensive to rent. The median rent is 140% of the median wage in London. No wonder the economy is flatlining. It's a disaster, and it's only getting worse. In fact, unaffordability is baked into the way in which we have been going about trying to resolve the housing issue by delivering more. And I'll give you an example, which is from Opportunity London. If you know what Opportunity London is, it's the Mayor introduced it, launched it in April, supported by London councils and all the volume house builders. London is a liquid and secure, offering long-term returns. It's trying to get capital in. And it has 9 schemes that it's pushing. And one scheme I just plucked out because your chair, although he's not here, is Thames Road in Barking. 3,500 homes. And they write, the scale of opportunity is significant. Forecast housing and rental price growth over the next 5 years in the borough are 22% and 16% respectively, above the London average. So London Opportunity is trying to solve the problem by exacerbating the problem, by creating more unaffordability, trying to suck in investment to create, on the basis that there'll be more unaffordable homes. It's not simply a matter of numbers. That's an absolutely critical thing, and there's obviously lots and lots of explanations, and I won't go into those unless asked as to what those issues are. But they're not. It is not simply numbers. It is not just about getting supply in. And our experience is that whenever developers, and it's quite rare, work with communities, supply happens, and it happens quickly. And the example I would give is the Shell Centre scheme, where the Canary Wharf Group came in 2012. They talked to us straight away, before they'd even got the gig with Shell. They talked to the community and worked with us, and they had a very comprehensive programme of a year and a half of engagement. And people accepted what was, when first built in 1962, as the largest single office building in Europe. They accepted 50% more office plus 800 homes on it, with affordable housing, some affordable housing on site, most of it off site. They built on a council-owned site down the road, very close. And the community came to terms with it. It's not perfect, it's not lovely, it's not gorgeous, but it does the job. And we worked well. And the alternative is 8 Albany Embankment and a lot of stuff in the V-Neb, where the community was not involved, the community took umbrage, and community pointed out these are terrible schemes being promoted, and have managed for 20 years to stop anything happening. So we've had 20 years of nothing happening on sites in Vauxhall because of that lack of engagement. So a really critical thing for delivery is engagement. That will help meet the unmet needs. But affordability is the critical issue. And much of that can't be resolved by planning. It's going to be requiring inputs from government to unlock sites, to support transport infrastructure. I mean, for example, the city in the east, we've got 250,000 homes are proposed for the city in the east, in Barking, Havering, Thamesmead, requiring 3 river crossings, premised on 3 river crossings, which will all require forward funding from government. And so clearly government is you know, it's not just a planning issue, it's government. And obviously with the social housing programme, we need government money.
Thanks for your introduction and explanation to that question. I know there's a couple of other people who are going to ask kind of questions in a similar field, and I know we were doing this before, not trying to kind of stray too far. But just to respond to some of the points that you made, particularly around how we get more local authority construction and community-led developments. And I know that kind of funding and other levers were mentioned, but I just wondered if anyone wanted to expand on anything else we could be doing.
Yep, I have a list already. So the first thing to say is obviously we've gone through a period of hyperinflation, which has affected our residents and increased and exacerbated cost of living pressures. So from a council housing perspective, we absolutely recognise the need to keep tight control of our rents. That said, our costs are increasing. So the 23-24 rent settlement has effectively taken £700 million out of London Council's development capacity. That means we can build less homes because we have less income and capacity to fund borrowing and to fund all the work that is involved in bringing forward development schemes. So the first thing that we need as councils, and housing associations need this as well, is a long-term settlement on rents that ensures our business plans remain viable. We could do two other measures that would help hugely is a continued and further increase in the Public Works Loan Board interest rate. That would enable, we already have a small increase for a couple of years, but we could do with a larger increase over a longer period of time, so it enables us to think and plan strategically about our development programmes. And something very close to our heart in councils is our right to buy receipts. Now, we've had some increased flexibilities over the use of those, but we would like to retain them all and have complete flexibility over how we use them, both for supporting new homes, acquiring land, but also investing in our own stock and doing estate regeneration, which brings together the potential to provide new homes and improve existing homes. So those kind of three measures would make a major change into our financial ability to really grow and accelerate our delivery programmes.
I'm just going to jump in slightly there and say I think maybe an expansion of CPO powers for local authorities may help with part of the solution. At the moment, yes, they have CPO powers, but I don't think they are strong enough to be able to get those sites, to be able to then deliver upon those sites. And as we've said previously on the panel, most housing delivery is undertaken by private developers, and that is a whole different kettle of fish to housing for the people from the administrative people that run that part of the borough. And I think that makes a big difference in who's delivering and for what outcome. And then those powers and those councils should be supported. And I don't think those powers are stringent enough yet.
Sorry, I'm not used to this. Can you repeat the question? I was thinking so hard about what I hadn't said when you asked your question.
So it was just picking up on what, how we can get more kind of local authority construction or community-led developments. What could we unblock? Obviously, we're kind of planning and regeneration, so kind of with a focus on planning. But yeah, anything that you wanted to add on? You know, people have mentioned some of the levers already, but anything else you wanted to add? So on how we get more local authority construction and community-led developments.
Yeah, I mean, the point I made earlier, talk to communities. Communities need to be involved. They need to be involved at all stages. In the previous session, someone was talking about the plan making, getting communities involved in the plan making, and it's very difficult. It's really, really important. We did a neighbourhood plan in Waterloo, which was, obviously, by definition, you get the communities involved, the communities leading it. And actually, we did a neighbourhood plan back in '72 when we first started campaigning. And it has led the way to the opportunity area that's currently there. It really gets results if you put in work like that. It makes the difference because you get a realism to it. So Waterloo, for example, I mean, I find it extraordinary that in '72 we put a plan together with the local authority, with the GLC. It was the first district plan accepted in '77, and it's fundamentally the same as the opportunity area. You know, it's updated, but with some shoulder pads. But it's so that is a really critical at both the plan making and at delivery, and working with local councils. Which, when I first started in Waterloo, I used to meet the chief planning officer every couple of months, and we used to just have a real, we chat about stuff. It was good. They don't have the capacity, and they also often don't have the political will to be able to do that. And everybody's just strapped. It's terrible. We need to get back to that situation where there's a real positive engagement. In fact, I saw a chief planning officer who's now in Redbridge or something. He was at Camden. He was in Lambeth 10 years ago, and he said, "Oh, it's great to see you." That's what it needs to be like, and we can be like that.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Before I come to you, Assembly Member Lord Bailey, a brief question.
You talked about the need to engage communities, and as an ex-youth worker, I fully see that. But two challenges. How do you get around the challenge of the usual suspects? I lived near a park growing up, and our lovely middle-class people took over the park and made sure nobody could play football. And there's a huge estate on the side with literally 700 kids in it. No football. Amazing. Because they were the usual suspects. And you have a small tangential piece. It was said in our earlier session this morning that the community consulted are the ones who are already housed. How do you involve people who are not housed and may be future participants in that community, move from elsewhere, etc.?
Well, don't forget the people who are not housed are largely, they're sofa surfing. They're around. They're my children. They're people who do live somewhere. They just don't live somewhere in a secure, proper accommodation, and that's the problem. So they absolutely can be talked to and consulted. It's difficult. It's not. I'm not saying. There's always people who shout loudest, and it's really important that we, that isn't allowed to prevail. And I didn't pick up where is the place you said the park? You said.
Many years ago, I used to live in Ladbroke Grove, down that way, and we had a park, Little Wormwood Scrubs, and they converted it and didn't let people play football in there, run around. They went for dog walking. My point is that the usual suspects, the organised, the educated, the people with time, i.e. money, how do we make sure those voices are heard when you consult a community? And I think the point about, I sofa surfed for years, I know what that's like, but how do you involve people who that community may have their welcome in, because they're not there yet, and how their needs part of the conversation? It just intrigues me when we talk about communities, because we give community great power, and that power could be abused.
I mean, the experience I've had is precisely that those people are involved, and people who live in a community do care about those people. I totally get your point about the park. That is constantly, that sort of issue needs to be dealt with, but and you need to put things in place like my group in Waterloo. We have regular meetings with youth groups, so you're talking to people who would not normally have anything to do with thinking about planning and development, but it's not, those things aren't easy, but they are totally doable.
Can I just jump in there to answer that question a little bit with my lecturer's hat on? I teach a module called Community Engagement and Participation, and we are teaching the students to encourage consultation with hard-to-reach groups, as we would describe them. And those are the BME communities, the homeless communities, the children, the youth, all the communities that if you go to a town hall meeting, you are unlikely to see. So the way I'm teaching my students to try and build that and community participation in hard-to-reach groups is go out to the established community areas. You might go to temples, churches, mosques. You might go to mother and baby groups. But that's what we're trying to encourage our students to do in their capacity, as whether they work in a spatial planning team or whether they work in a development management kind of team. But where they have the capacity to engage with the community, then they should be doing it early doors and trying to think about all of the people that they don't usually get at their town hall meetings. And we encourage them to find out where those organisations are. If they might be part of an organisation, it might mean that you've got to consult with a soup kitchen on a Saturday morning. But that's what we are encouraging our students to do.
Thank you. It's just a challenge of the groups that don't exist. That's what I'm really concerned about. If you're a council, for instance, you will know that a very established community will want things a certain way, but a council has to think about who's a month away, who's 10 years away, who's 20 years away. And I'm really just desperate to make sure those voices are heard as well, so we don't stop people being involved in communities they don't already exist in.
Okay.
Chair, back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Small-Edwards.
Thank you, everyone. Focus really on the planning system itself and what the kind of challenges and opportunities are within it to improve and increase housing development in London, and kind of what reforms you would suggest to improve housing supply whilst maintaining the quality and sustainability aspects, potentially with a focus on the London plan. Thank you.
I'll jump in there first with this question. I've thought about the question a fair bit, and actually I think resourcing, the front loading of applications, like the planning application process in itself, and I know we heard quite a lot of it from the developers this morning, but front loading of applications at the moment doesn't work as well as I think people thought it was going to work. And that is a flaw in the planning system, but largely that's a flaw with also resourcing. There is not the people, like you front load an application, even the small, medium enterprises, they front load an application, which means they get an energy consultant for the energy, they get the flood risk consultant for the flooding, they get an ecology consultant for the BNG. If it means that all the consultants need to be employed at the offset, that is then, you know, a barrier on cost and how much delivery you can get, because they've already used a chunk of money for all of those consultants. It then goes through to the planning system, yet the councils don't have enough resourcing or even the expertise to be able to understand the information given to them and then be able to make a decision on, or an effective decision or a timely decision on that information, because the expertise aren't there. There's a huge gap in planning resourcing at the moment, and I think we need to change some of that grassroots level kind of resourcing gaps to be able to then get that delivery on the ground. But it's a fairly long process. I mean, I'm at London South Bank University. We are the second oldest planning school in the country and the largest degree apprenticeship provider in London. And even where we are still we're the largest degree apprenticeships for town planning, our numbers aren't huge. And so we need basically local authorities, private consultancies to come on board and get people into planning. I'm doing a lot of work with the RTPI, the Royal Town Planning Institute, at the moment in trying to get people into the profession. But that all comes down to trying to leverage that resourcing. But you won't see that until the next, 2-5 years until they're qualified. But that's still not experience. Experience is retiring, experience is jumping into the private sector. And so that's a big problem with councils and delivery of housing.
Just sorry, as a follow-up to that, do you think the process could then be simplified? Do you think it's too complex at the moment?
I think it's too complex. I think it's vastly complex. And yes, we did talk about the same requirements for the big developers, like the Barretts of the world, competing against the niche SMEs. I have good friends who work for, in a consultancy basis, work for, somebody trying to deliver maybe 6 houses. The BNG requirements set out that you either pay £70,000 as the uplift or you plant 37 trees on your tiny little site, which doesn't seem feasible when it's such a small development happening. I do think that the planning system needs to simplify much more, and grades of simplification actually dependent on how are you going to get that planning permission through and delivered. And it might be, like they said in the last panel, working on how fast track works. What do you get with fast track?
Just on the simplification area, one thing that possibly could be improved is the statutory consultee process. So we're all working in a system of organisations that are multiply under-resourced, and that applies to the statutory consultees, who have to churn out responses bespoke to every application every time, and then our planners have to review and assess those. Actually, is there a more strategic way that we can make sure we play in the views of the statutory consultees? I think that would be really useful. The other thing is, and I know the planning community in London greatly kind of respects the GLA planning team and enjoys working with them on planning issues, but we do have this referral process that's set at quite a low bar at 100 units. Is there scope to increase and raise that threshold so that we can move schemes more quickly? And when there is national calling of schemes, can that be accelerated as well? So some simplification, but I go back to my original point about the resourcing of local authorities, because local authority core budgets fund your planning departments, both development management and strategic planning, and if they're under pressure they cannot invest strategically. So if councils and the council housing part of the local authority has a long-term financial plan, it can help to underwrite the planning function at a more strategic level. So it does come down to simplification and efficiency, but it also comes down to resourcing. And we've got lots of creative across London. We're doing lots of creative things to attract planners into the profession, to take on apprenticeships, to grow that planning knowledge base, which, you know, a lot of people are drawn to. A lot of people want to deliver local authority planning services. So it does come down to a stable financial picture for local authorities to be able to do that.
The key problem that we experience all the time is speculation. That's what doesn't deliver. Sites that sit around for years with developers speculating that maybe they could add another 2 floors. I know there's 2 sites, one in Streatham, one in Sydenham, just currently about to be referred to the Mayor, both approved by the local authorities, which, you know, they've spent 4 years in the process of trying to get from 12 stories to 14 stories and then back to 13 stories, you know, etc. Why? Because there's no clarity on the heights there. They should be. The London plan says you should be identifying places for tall buildings in local plans, and Lambeth did that, never identified this site, even while this process was going on. It's been going on for 4 years. So they should have done, and the problem with the London plan, one of the changes, it needs to say that you must do this. You must identify sites, not, you know, you can do it, but then there might be some other windfall sites, because these weren't windfall sites. These were sites that were actually being talked about and discussed while the local authority was working up the plan, doing the Reg 19, went through the inquiry, all the rest of it, and then now come up with another part of the plan, and they still haven't mentioned these sites. So that approach is disastrous. It means the site isn't developed, and we've got loads of sites. I mean, in Waterloo, we've got sites that created by the war. They're bomb sites from the war, and they're still undeveloped. There's one that was approved for 600 homes 15 years ago, and it still hasn't been built. It's recently just got another approval for a whole load of offices and some homes, and it just goes up and up and up. So getting, ending that speculation, and the key thing is to have control of heights and of density. The density matrix was chucked out from the last London plan. It was in the previous London plans. So density can just be pushed up and up and up. And that is just, it's constantly a negotiation. And many developers, you know, it's that last million that's going to buy them the yacht. That is what they'll hold out for, that extra bit. They'll battle for that extra bit. it's worth a few months and, you know, a few £1,000s to spend on trying to get that extra bit, and it's terrible. It blights communities, it blights the relationships, and obviously it blights the sites, and it doesn't deliver. So the one thing that is often complained about about planning in general in Britain is it's so in England it's so discretionary, and that discretionariness is really exemplified by the issue of density and height. I think many things in the London Plan are good, and there's lots. This is the best London Plan there's been. You know, we formed from the first London Plan. When the first London Plan was coming out, Just Space formed because we all met each other at the EIP for that first London Plan in 2003, and said we're having the same battles. What the hell's going on? And trying to understand what was being proposed. This is a much better plan. It is complex, but it's not. It's sophisticated. It's complex for the right reasons. You know, the good growth strategies that underpin it are really solid stuff. But it has far too much where there is discretion, and it needs to be get more clarity, more certainty, more clarity about priorities. About can we dump child play space when we want to put this housing up, or the trees that you were just talking about, or the dual aspect. You know, the scheme I'm talking about, they've got single aspect in 70% of the houses, the flats proposed for the affordable, not in the market housing, and that's the sort of contentious thing that it ends up. The committee could have refused it on that grounds, and we're now trying to get the mayor to call it in on that ground. You know, amongst others, the new MP for the area has written to the mayor asking him to call it in on that ground. We want to get much more clarity on those things. You don't argue about space standards or safety standards. We need to get similar clarity on many other standards, daylight standards, for example.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we move on to our next set of questions, I'd like to welcome Emmanuel Community School. Nice to meet you all. We're talking about developing new housing in London for the next 10 years. So hopefully by then you'll be thinking about where you want to live, away from your parents. But it's a pleasure to see you all. And I understand that you'll be spending some time with Lord Bailey a little later on, but we'll continue our questions. So that takes us on to Assembly Member Wilson. Or was it Baker? Sorry, my mistake.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, panel, and thanks for your answers so far. So I'm going to ask you in a moment what you think the key changes in any way should be in the London Plan in order to help delivery on the homes we need. But I would just like to follow up just a couple of questions that, on what's been answered so far, because I asked the previous panel what the balance of changes to the planning system, in terms of not getting the homes we need, how much of that was problems with the planning system and needed planning reform, however you interpret that, and how much were other things that are problems, and particularly, Joanne, you've referred to some of the issues we have. Do you have a sense of how much of it is problems that can be solved through the planning system and how much are the problems that need to be solved elsewhere?
I'm going to go with like a 50-50 approach, unfortunately, here. I really am. And it's because there are problems with the planning system. It's very intricate. We're assessing some things that maybe don't need to be assessed at the particular stage it is being assessed. However, there's a resourcing problem. There's a construction materials problem. There's a construction skills problem. We need more people to develop. It needs to be viable development. And when the balance of the planning system and its requirements against the viability of building out, good housing, actually it's a 50-50 sort of split, I would say. We need to simplify the system, but we also need resourcing, and something needs to be done relating to like materials and maybe subsidies of some sort to be able to get building again. We need councils building. which doesn't happen so much anymore. So maybe that needs to really be looked into. How can we get councils building again?
Thanks. And before I come to the rest of the panel, I have to say, I think you're the only person we've heard from today who's actively sort of said we need to rip up some of the stuff in the plan, which I think is quite an interesting because the first panel did reference some issues that they saw as complex, but when probed, they were like, no, actually, we just need to make sure it all lines up. Now, that's what's been said. So, and specifically, you've referenced the same requirement twice, which is the biodiversity net gain. I'm by no means an expert, but generally when people reference the same thing over and over again, you're like, well, what other things have you actually got to refer to that we need to rip up? Are you actually saying that some homes should be built at a lesser quality with a bigger impact on the environment and, in this case, or are there other ways to fix that? I'm just going to give you the opportunity to say that because you have said it twice now, and I want to be clear. Are you saying we need to rip up some of the regulation that we already have?
I don't think we need to rip up some of the regulation. I think we need to keep the regulation that we've got because we do need to go towards a more sustainable environment and a more sustainable way of building. And, 15 years ago, we didn't have things like BNG requirements. We used to have some requirements, and they did the job fastly. So what I'm saying is it's great to have those requirements, and we should have requirements. But when we are looking at actually delivering that housing, some of those requirements, I think, are too much. So maybe it's 10% net gain for the vast majority of developers.
Yeah.
But when we are looking at SME developers, our council developers, could we not give them 5% net gain?
Okay, so you do think we should water stuff down?
But I do think we should water stuff down because we are still getting a net gain, but we are getting more delivery for that.
Do you think our understanding of how construction impacts sort of the environment and our natural world has developed in the last 15 years? Do you think that's why we have more restrictive requirements on building? And I'll say again, is there another way of achieving that isn't just saying we are going to water down these requirements?
I think our understanding has developed vastly, absolutely vastly. But then you are, making trade-offs as to whether you want something delivered. And what I'm saying is that those requirements, especially on the small to medium-sized businesses, like the London Plan talks about delivery of housing on small sites. And it has targets for delivery of housing on small sites. They make up 20%, just over 20%, I think it's about 23% of the target. But those are being stalled, and I honestly believe that it's being stalled because of the quite stringent requirements. So those small sites won't be coming through because those developers can't viably develop those sites. So is it a watering down? We're still giving an uplift of net gain, so I don't think it is a watering down, but it's not the same expectation as the Barratt Homes and the Wimpy Homes of the world, where they have that cash and they've said that they have the cash to be able to deliver those kinds of uplifts. So is it a watering down? I don't think so, but I think you need to be proportional to the size of business you are expecting to develop and deliver.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for bearing with me with that. I'll go back to the question I was asking, which is about the balance of how much needs to be changes into the planning system and how much delivering our housing needs to be other aspects of it. Joanne, you did probably speak more about this earlier on, so please do.
Yeah, so you can have a perfect planning system, but if a mixed economy of developers can't confidently bring forward schemes, then it doesn't help at all. So in my mind, it's about getting that mixed economy of viable schemes to be brought forward that can then invest in a planning system very broadly that's actually got the headspace and the ability to transform itself, to respond in a more strategic way to the delivery at the pace that we need. So I do think we need to support our planning system to become what it needs to be.
Thanks, Joanne. Michael.
Yeah, the endless attack on the planning system is just obviously completely misplaced. 90% of planning applications are approved, much to the chagrin sometimes of our members. There are much bigger things that are going on. The financial instability that we've seen, the turbulence over the last few years, for example, the inflation. Inflation costs, put build costs up. Fiona Fletcher-Smith of L&Q told me build costs 20% through inflation, plus the interest rates. A whole lot of their schemes don't stack up. So these are nothing to do with planning. I'm just reading here some stats that 13% of all homes purchased in London were bought by overseas investors between 2014 and 2016. And 42% of those new builds purchased by foreign investors were left unoccupied. So there's about 5% of the new builds, using that amount. It's about 5% of the new builds. They are investment opportunities rather than homes. That's the problem. We're not just building homes, we're building investment opportunities. And we need to decouple that. And the current system, not the planning process, but the priorities we've given to it, mean that decoupling doesn't happen. And there's a much huger long-term issue, which is that we've got these legally binding environmental policy goals. We're supposed to get to net zero X. And again, a stat I picked up at midnight last night that between 2022 and 2050, under current policy, housing alone would consume 104% of England's cumulative carbon budget, which is just extraordinary. And the number of new builds, only 1% of new builds get EPC A grade. So what we're storing up in the future, in 20 or 30 years' time, we're going to have to retrofit them. So that's why the London plan is complex. That's why it's appropriately complex and sophisticated, because there's a lot of issues. It's not just a matter of numbers. It's not just a matter of square feet. But it's certainly not the fundamental problem of planning as a process. And it's pathetic that our political system, every few years, some politicians decide they're going to kick planning. It's
Apologies, but we thought we'd invite you along to it so we could have a kick at planning anyway. No, we genuinely want to hear the
I know.
I'm
obviously not talking. I'm not talking about you guys. I'm not talking about you guys.
No,
absolutely not. But it's an endless rebarbative conversation. It's just daft. And it's not about that. It's not about twiddling with the planning process. Of course, there are policy priorities, and we need to get those firmer, get those clearer, so that we end this speculation and we get certainty. And obviously, we want stability. Stability is the thing that will, in every sense, we want stability in terms of what's actually the planning process is producing. And the developers need stability in order to make their sums work.
Can I ask you about something you specifically raised in the answer before, which is around speculation, and after planning permission is given, some developers holding on to sites for quite some time. What do you think could actually be done to stop that? Is that something that we can do within planning, or is that something that we need to tackle elsewhere?
Well, again, there was a politician who talked about use it or lose it a few years ago. I think it was Michael Gove, but what happened to him? There needs to be a process to put that into play. I mean, it's pathetic. You can dig a trench. I mean, a number of times I've seen developers and they get a permission, and they literally on the last day, 3 blokes turn up with a mixer and they dig a hole and that's it, and then it's forever. And it stymies the site. Literally, there's a site behind the National Theatre. That's what they did in 2000 and got permission in 2008. Dug a hole in 2012. It's still vacant today. It's been empty since the 80s. Yeah. And so that ending that sort of stuff. I mean, it requires legislation. And there needs legislation on that, and there needs legislation on the whole issue of the circular economy, because outside conservation areas you can just demolish, and the battle we're having on 72 Upper Ground in Waterloo is precisely that. There's a perfectly good building could be turned into 200 flats, an office building, only 50 years old, and it's to be demolished for speculative office development, which could be done with the flats, but because there isn't a requirement in law to not go that route first, and not look at that route first, there is in policy, but it's not in law, and so it's fallen away, and the same went with the M&S decision.
Thanks.
So there's law issues that need to be changed on this.
No, that's really helpful. It helps us to put things in context. So I'm going to go back down with the question I should have asked, thank you, Chair, which is specifically around the London Plan, around, in terms of housing delivery and meeting our housing needs, what key updates would you think need to be done, put into the London Plan to assist in that? And I'd also like to add on, obviously in the most recent mayoral campaign, the Mayor committed to looking at further mayoral development corporations and land assembly zones. And do you think that is also part of the mix in terms of delivery of the homes we need?
I'll go first on this one. As I said, what I've been talking about, the London Plan is in many ways very good. One of the key things is monitoring. Monitoring is just deficient, to put it nicely. We're several years behind. We're monitoring far less than we used to do. The opportunity areas, we've got 47 of them. They get these opportunity area planning frameworks, and there's virtually no real. There's a technical monitoring. There's a page on the website, but it's hopeless. And there are many opportunity areas that are not doing what they should be doing, and it's a real opportunity, and I ask your panel to investigate opportunity areas. I think this is an area that you really would really help, because it's the major brownfield resource in London, and the city in the east, the 250,000 homes. That's actually was in Ken Livingstone's first London Plan. Most of it hasn't been delivered. What's going on? How do you do them? And as I've said about getting some clarity on the to try and stop the speculation. That's a really critical thing. And the deprioritising viability. I was interested in hearing in the last session, and I've got 4 boxes in my office just from the Battersea Power Station viability, and it was the last version. There were umpteen versions. 4 boxes of these you just spreadsheet after spreadsheet. I mean, it's completely incomprehensible. I've done lots of viability assessments when they first came in, because you got to know them. They just run rings around you now with huge. So that needs to deprioritise. It's actually something that needs to change in the MPPF in order for the London Plan to deprioritise it. The London Plan actually invented viability. An officer, Duncan Bowie, is very proud of the fact that he invented it, and well, he says he invented it. He says he did it with the 3 Dragons in Nottingham back in 2004. They came up with this wacky wheeze, and for several years they got until the crash they got the figures up through using that, but it's now been turned. It is a perennial problem in all public policy that. How do you keep up with the big money? But it's very much a problem with viability, and it needs to be deprioritised.
That's really helpful. Thanks very much. And back along, so it's what would you like to see changed in the London Plan, and whether mayoral development corporations and land assembly zones can assist?
So 2 main things on the London Plan, and I'll particularly talk about Enfield from the first one, and that is 4 or 5 years ago when we were developing our local plan, which is now the Reg 19 stage. We were very clear that we did not have enough brownfield land to meet our housing needs in the borough. So we really welcome the new government's direction on introducing a new MPPF that enables local authorities to consider the use of what we would understand as grey belt in our borough, because that's land that may technically be green belt but is actually previously used adjacent to public transport infrastructure, which has all the potential to be put into use for some quality housing that is so desperately needed. So really welcome that change, and our local plan does progress a strategy on that basis, so we'd like to see a London plan that sort of supports and conforms with that. The other issue that we have in London more broadly is that we had a house building period in the 60s and 70s where we put up tall buildings of traditional construction types like large panel systems. We think buildings are going to last forever. These buildings are now coming to the end of their life quite rapidly, and often they were put up on constrained sites that don't yield the ability to create viable new housing developments. So what we're left with on the London plan has a requirement to replace the same amount of affordable housing that was previously there. It may not be possible on some of those sites, so you're left with some of these old buildings that don't have a future lifespan, but and we may be able to deliver some more better affordable housing, but not at the same rate because we can't go as high with the same density. So we would like to see some change to the London plan to take a more pragmatic, I think it's plan policy H8, to take a wider view about how we tackle the issue about replacing and renewing our aged housing stock. On development corporations, I think there are areas across London where we have landowners that really we could intervene to bring them together to create and support and accelerate development where it's previously not happened organically through the market. We have an area in Enfield which could yield 2,500 more homes if we could do that. So I think locally led development corporations have a real role to play, and I think the mayor, you know, in terms of his powers in regards to TfL, so some of these areas have got cross-rail safeguarding lands that are they appropriate in the current environment? Do we need to look more strategically? So I think they can be a tool, but I'm very conscious around the sort of feeling of the community that it needs, and I mean the wider community, including landowners, feeling that they are in the driving seat with this agenda. So I think there is a role, but locally led corporations would be good.
Thanks very much, and sorry I was listening whilst having a coughing fit there. Thank you very much. Jayshree.
A lot of what's been said, to be honest, but also I'd say monitoring needs a stronger emphasis in the London plan. There's a few policies within, especially the housing chapter, you know, policy H9, ensuring the best use of stock, but who's monitoring it? What are the consequences of not ensuring the best use of stock? If you look on Airbnb in London, there are over 1,000 properties, entire homes, entire apartments that you can rent out for the weekend. Now, that for me is probably not the best use of stock when we have a huge housing problem. So maybe we could do something to strengthen the controls over best use of stock and monitoring. The other thing is accountability. Who takes accountability, one, for that monitoring, and secondly, what are the consequences? Nothing happens unless there are consequences to some of what you want to change or fix. So is it councils taking responsibilities? Is it owners taking responsibilities? Where does that responsibility lie? And I think there needs to be more accountability, and I think that the London plan is actually a good place to be able to make policies around that accountability. I think the other thing, so like looking at empty homes and things, the stronger emphasis on grey belt, which we've heard, I honestly think that should be in the London plan. I'm looking at a site in Slough at the moment, and it was previously developed. It is part of a country park, but it is just concrete next door to an industrial area, all of which is in the green belt. It doesn't seem to make sense to keep it as overgrown scrubland when there's tarmac all over it and the weeds are just growing through the tarmac. So that policy change, I think, is really key. Totally support local development corporations. We have a site in Redbridge at the moment, and Redbridge is a borough which does deliver a fair bit of housing, but also there's a lot of strain on that Redbridge area because it's those outer London boroughs which are seeing more and more people move out to. And actually, there's a site with lots of mixed ownership, but being able to bring that together to be able to realise what the local plan says about building high, building tall in that location because it's appropriate in that location. It's not going to be realised until we get those development partnerships together.
Can I just come back a couple of things that I didn't say? You asked about development corporations for a start, and they're interesting. They both set up by Boris, the two we've got, and the Old Oak and Barking. Both have a huge democratic deficit, and that is a real problem. If it weren't for that, and if they were given much stronger CPO powers, so Old Oak is being held up to ransom by the car company that sits on that great piece of land in the middle of it, you know, demanding all the hope value. Hopefully the government will change on this, and then that'll be able to unlock it. So that plus a real democratic accountability, because I mean Old Oak has got three boroughs, and none of them are in control. And the mayor doesn't, because the GLA has been set up as such a light touch organisation. The mayor it doesn't have the capacity to really do this. And so going to the government and saying we need, I mean, there's a whole load of things we need to support the mayor on. Going to, you know, he needs to get rent controls, he needs to get a proper budget for housing, but he also, you know, this control over that issue, and more resource for him to be able to, and the GLA to be able to do its job. So that's the first thing. Second thing, on public land. Public land says in the plan, you know, 50% affordable housing required on public land, and it just doesn't happen. I talked about the Albion Embankment one. It's London Fire Brigade site for 20 years. They've been trying to get away with you know, at one point 15% affordable housing, approved by the mayor. I mean, overturned by the Secretary of State. That's what it took. Cavalry Barracks is the most extraordinary example, where out in Hounslow, we're 20%, I think, affordable housing. On the viability, because they said the existing use value of a cavalry barracks is so high. Who the hell needs a cavalry barracks? What do you mean existing use value is so high? This is nonsense. I joked and haggled with the officer who passed that off. It's terrible. You know, we need to really use this public land. The London Fire Brigade, I mean, they're strapped for cash. They're desperately trying to get some money as they can out of that Albion Embankment site. One understands that, but it is not the appropriate thing to do. They need to be London Fire Brigade needs to be properly funded, but we need to use that site properly, and it could take a lot of housing. And then on green belts, we don't have a policy on green belts. And by the way, I presume you've all had a copy of the manifesto. Oh, yes. You've all had this, haven't you? You're all bored to death with it.
Don't worry, but everyone watching has now seen it as well, so that's good.
So we don't have any members. No one's ever raised the green belt because we just don't have any members. Although there was a recent discussion at the London Forum about it, and members in Enfield. But what I'm worried about is the MOL. MOL, Metropolitan Open Land, is based on Greenbelt, and we mustn't see the MOL eroded in the same way. And I give you what I think is the perfect example. Jubilee Gardens, next to the London Eye. 5 attempts to redevelop it. That was considered grey belt. It was like, why this? Yeah, well, because it wasn't. After the GLC went into dilapidation, and it was just a muddy path to the Eye for 10 years. And there were lots of plans put forward to redevelop it, build under it, build over it, and put the grass on top of it, etc., etc. And the local community held out, and we've now got it as a community trust opened by the Queen in 2012. It's the Blade for Blade. It is the most used public park in London. It is extraordinary. Next to it is a car park, Greybell. Been a car park since the war, since the Festival of Britain. Again, protected as MOL. And well, you know, it's Greybell. Yeah, it is. It's still car park. The Shell development, they put £11 million into buying that site from the South Bank Centre to then turn it into open space. And the open space is coming. We're working on it right now. There's still pressure to, de-designate it. And a bit of it was de-designated. But so we really need to resist this short-termism on MOL. And we need to make sure that there isn't I resist the short-termism that could appear given the what's proposed for the Green Belt.
I think that's a really helpful challenge. Thank you very much for all of you for those answers. And back to you, Chair.
Before I come to Assembly Member Turrell, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that some of you said, just for clarity. So, Jayashree, I think you did in your exchange with Assembly Member Baker address some of this, but you did mention at the top of your introduction as well potential changes to the legislation in place around planning. And just following through the example that you gave of the differentials in expectations on large versus small developers, I wonder all of your reflections on this particular point, and this is not scientific, but we have all obviously been out canvassing in different parts of the country in the last 3 weeks, some of us happier than others about the outcome. But one of the things that I did notice was I was out and kind of in passing said to, this was outside of London, in passing said to people as we were kind of speaking to people, new build development, the first one that we went to, it was very nice, the houses were very nice, very car-led, as many of these places are, but there were no trees, and it was the baking hot day. At another new development, bigger, similar sort of architecture, there were trees, and kind of a running joke of the day was, wouldn't it be wonderful if every developer had to build trees, because this is going to be horrendous in 10 years' time. It's awful now, and it's only kind of 5 years in. And I just wonder, do you agree that that is an unintended consequence of small developers who are not building 5 or 6, but they might be building maybe 30, 40 units, and cumulative, as the first panel said, if those people are building half of the homes, we'll end up with half of the developments in London which are unbearable to live in. And I don't know if that was perhaps some of the point that was being made. I just wonder, the bonfire of the red tape that took place under Lord Cameron still, when he was Prime Minister, was an unmitigated disaster for housing and planning and regeneration. And we got Grenfell as a result of that. I just, in thinking about, and I hope you write back to the committee, what it is that you'd like to see go, I would like to understand what you think are the unintended consequences of that change, which is a good thing to meet a need now, but that need needs to be sustainable, because once those homes are built, people need to live in them, and if they are unbearable, then we have a whole other set of problems which become very expensive in 5 years' time. We've just shunted the cost. So that was a broad question stroke statement to all of you.
I think we need to keep a lot of the standards we've got. I think we should do, you know how we do, for example, stamp duty on a sliding scale. I think we should have a sliding scale dependent on how great the need is in a particular area, and that comes down to our discretionary system.
I agree with the spirit of the question, but I would say it's extremely unbearable to live with 2 or 3 children in a hotel for a year, 2 years, and the pressing need that we have for homes and a roof over people's heads, I think requires some sensible pragmatism, but I 100% agree with the placemaking aspects we need to hold dear.
I mean, I obviously agree with that sentiment. I mean, we must hold on to those things. They are very important, but we also must get people out of bed and breakfast, and such like my son's one of my son's best friends. Every 6 months he moves. He's now 4 miles away from his school. He started out 100 yards away from his school. It's awful, absolutely awful. But it isn't as I said right at the beginning, this isn't fundamentally, it's about changing the environment from trying to use land as speculation and putting price. The reason why that poor lad is moving is all the time is because it's in private rented sector. The rents are going up, they cannot afford it, they move out and out and out, further and further out. We've got to cut this, we've got to end this. And we can't end it suddenly, it would be a disaster. I mean, the economy would collapse. It's got to slowly be deflated. Rent controls are obviously the first key, but there are many detailed ways. But what we can't do is give up on placemaking or on net zero or any of those key things. Otherwise, you know, the example you gave of Grenfell is all too bitter.
Thank you. I will hand over to Assemblymember Wilson. I guess my point was really, I take your point and I absolutely 100% agree about the temporary accommodation crisis taking place across the country, but really acute in the capital. I am still sceptical that making those things optional on any part of the sector, whether they would happen at all, and I'm sceptical that that delivery would be sped up to meet that need, I guess is my point. So I just thinking about it in the round, but we'll come to that at the point that we do have the review of the London plan.
Just to make that point, I agree with your scepticism. It's just clarity. With child play space, you know, there was a clarity, although it's not actually written in the plan quite in a clear way. It was made very clear by, I think it was under Ken Livingstone, that he would not accept anything less than what's required in the child play space. And it's been accepted ever since. That set level of clarity on whatever those issues are, whether it's trees or whatever, we need to have that.
Thank you. Assemblymember Wilson.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to take part in this meeting. I know I'm not a full member of the committee, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be part of it as an observer and certainly make some comments as well as we go along. There are a lot of really interesting issues discussed both in this session and in the previous panel discussion, and I think all of us, I think, will agree that the importance of trying to do whatever we can to increase and speed up both the decision making and subsequently, once decisions are made, the delivery, even if we have slightly different perspectives of how we might try and get there. I think to start off, sort of picking up on a few issues that have already been discussed in principle already, but I think perhaps trying to probe a little bit more into the detail. And I think it's directly following from both Assemblymember Baker's and the Chair's comments on the idea of simplification. And this is something I do come at from a different perspective. I think I would welcome seeing how that could work. I think the previous government's review of the London Plan talked of the need to try and reduce some of the complexity. I welcome that as a principle, but I'd like a little bit more detail about what areas that could actually work without compromising the quality, but where we can try and make some practical changes to turn that, what I think is a sound principle, into something deliverable. And obviously, I think, Jayshree, probably start with you if that's okay. And then the second point that has been mentioned in kind of almost in passing, but again I think could be I'd be interested to hear a bit more detail how that could be simplified and streamlined, is that the GLA referral process, whether it's just a question of increasing the threshold for referrals, or whether is stage 2 really necessary at all, or things like that, if perhaps. And then I've got another question I'd like to come back with once we've dealt with those. Thank you.
In terms of simplification, I think you need to, in the context of the delivery of housing, the delivery of good quality housing, and I think there's been a lot of unintended consequences from, the Conservative government. They've brought in things like office to residential development, as a permitted development rights. There's a lot of permitted development rights that have had unintended substandard housing impacts. So I think you've got to be fairly careful, but what I'm talking about in terms of simplification is where it suits, and given our system is discretionary, I think things like a sliding scale for some of the requirements, maybe bringing back the emphasis on outline permission. Previously, lots of people used to go in with outline permission, or an outline application, so they could get the parameters of the development down. They may not have all the detail, but the parameters were there. What they would have to maybe pay in terms of contributions might be there. But at the moment, I think that you front load applications, so there's a big legislative requirement, which is a hindrance, I think, for a lot of developers. I think that if there was a sliding scale of maybe requirements, or we go back to that outline permission first, and then it's got to do with cost before you'd go out in with an outline, and then you'd get a reserved matters permission for all those matters which were reserved. Whereas at the moment you're going in with mainly a full application which has all the details in it, which is a huge upfront cost. So maybe we should be encouraging that outline stage, which is largely gone out of the window as such, because the fees of an outline are very similar to the fees of a full planning application. And so maybe that's somewhere we try and, I say simplify, go back to where we were. And I don't mean it in a bad sense of going backwards, I mean it in the sense of maybe let's get the parameters down, and then that will speed up development in terms of simplification. And maybe sliding scales of who the developers are and what they are proposing, like we do with, stamp duty.
Yeah, on simplification, I think it would be useful at the moment to look at tenure, perhaps. I'm really conscious that we're seeing a massive change in the private rented sector, with landlords either withdrawing from the lower end of the market or withdrawing completely. We're waiting to see whether that is resulting in new properties coming through on the sales market, because it's not in relation to the change that we're seeing. But if there is more second-hand homes for people to get onto the housing ladder, do we need to think differently about the intermediate housing products, of which there are a range of different options, and are they a bit too complicated, and are they actually affordable? And should we just for the next period be focusing on social rent, so sale and social rent, and would that make the remit for planning teams more straightforward and simple, and would it make it easier for developers? I am conscious about the drop-off in the Section 106 affordable housing market, and we clearly need to intervene, both councils and housing associations, to ensure that those homes are not brought forward because there's no market for them. So I think now is the time to look at tenure and what we really prioritise in London. And I think with a reduction in the private rented sector, we do need more social rent homes. So be looking there. The second stage referral process, I'm kind of aware that the government is mooting around the centralisation of determinations on large infrastructure schemes. So is now the time to look at the various tiers in the planning process. I think that the planning community would say there are times when the second stage referral process is actually quite useful in terms of achieving outcomes for schemes. So I wouldn't necessarily throw it completely out, but I do think now is the time to look at it. I think the 100-unit threshold is too low. And I think does need to be reformed. But yeah, so I think now is the time to look at that whole area.
On the GLA referral process, it's very odd. From experience as a community, you don't even know about it. Most people are completely unaware of it, and it doesn't really have any impact in terms of community quite often, which is terrible. The stage one could be a place where there should be, I think there should be real teeth in terms of the report saying to the local authority and the developer, this is where it clearly fails the London plan, and this needs to be resolved. This needs to be improved upon. That's sort of what the stage one does, but it does it very sort of meekly. Virtually every single stage one letter says doesn't quite comply with the London plan because of X, Y, and Z. But I think that's where the teeth need to come. But actually, the real issue is we've got, certainly in Waterloo and Vauxhall, for example, we've got strategic development all along there that's affecting not just the borough of Lambeth, but Lambeth are making the decision, and also piled up with all the costs and the consequences of that. These are huge sites, the South Bank Centre, etc. They have huge implications. But virtually every case I've dealt with on those areas, they have implications for the World Heritage Site, for St Paul's Cathedral, those views. These are strategic matters that the London Mayor really should be responsible for. The GLA Act never set it up like that, and I think we need to do something about that, because the only recourse is call-ins. And so that's what I've managed to get 15 call-ins along those South Bank sites, because Westminster has gone crazy, Camden's gone crazy, and Lambeth or Southwark is happy because they've got £11 million coming in annually from the business rates for a development, so it's not surprising. So there needs to be a strategic, but it requires a legal change. On the complexity, I mean, as I've said many times, the complexity. I think the complexity is good, but the priorities, we need to simplify on the priorities. And actually one of the real problems in this plan is the focus on design-led solutions. Design-led solutions are great, but you really need to set out, these are the parameters. So this is the density. Yes, you could do a design-led, but this is the maximum density. This is the maximum height. Now see what you can do. At the moment, it's too design-led, so we can go as high as we like or as dense as we like, and that just creates the speculation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we are slightly over, so would it be okay with you if we write to the panel with your final questions and ask them for a written response?
Okay, I mean, it was just a very quick one, if I may.
Okay,
obviously, the new government and the Chancellor's announcements yesterday, some really quite interesting stuff there, and I think you probably wouldn't expect me to say this. I actually welcome the fact we have a government that is keen to crack on and build stuff, and then how we do that is obviously the next kind of discussion. But this idea of grey belt, which has been talked about, and I know, Joanne, you mentioned it earlier on, just do we have any idea of actually the scale and what on the impact that could mean for London, and particularly in the context of Bernadette's comments earlier about either build up or build out? Is this something that could really help here in London, and if so, how do we enshrine that into policy?
I don't have the scale for London, but we can follow up with that. But certainly, talking from an Enfield point of view, the scale that would deliver for us in terms of meeting our housing needs is significant. So I believe that there are areas across London where it would do the same thing, and it would be part of our solution.
Thank you. It'd be great if you wouldn't mind to send that to the committee. We can circulate that. Thank you very much. So, we've now reached the end of the session. I'd like to thank all three of you for attending this session and for your contributions. They've been extremely helpful and hopefully will inform any recommendations we may make as a committee. We have a few short items of business. You're welcome to stay, or if you want to head off, then you're very welcome to do that as well. So for members of the committee, can I ask you to note the report and the discussion? Okay. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from this discussion? Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting held on the 29th of February 2024? Are we confirming? Yep, okay. Can we note the completed, closed and ongoing actions arising from the committee's previous meetings? Great. Can we note the action taken by the former chair of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the report shaping the future of the London plan and the London and the 15-minute city opinion piece? Yep. Okay. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme and additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely the committee's away day on the 5th of June 2024? Yep. And the next meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee will take place on Monday, the 9th of September at 2 p.m. in the Chamber at City Hall. So I have no urgent business and therefore say this meeting is concluded.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.